Silas Crowder didn't knock. He never knocked. That was the first thing people in the valley learned about him. The man walked through doors like he owned everything behind them, and half the time, he did. He shoved open the door to Bram Hawthorne's kitchen on a Tuesday morning without so much as a boot scrape on the mat, dropped a folded paper on the breakfast table hard enough to rattle the coffee cups, and looked across the room at Elowen like she was a painting he was thinking about buying. "Tell your father," Silas said, his voice smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once been told no and expected to stay told, "that I'll give him $40 for the girl's hand. Cash, no conditions." Elowen set down her coffee. The kitchen went very still. "I'm standing right here," she said. Silas smiled. It didn't reach anything above his jaw. "I know you are, sweetheart." Before we go any further, if you've never watched one of our stories before, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the bell so you don't miss what happens next. Stories like this one don't come around every week, and we want you here for every twist. While you're at it, tap the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Elowen Hawthorne and the autumn that changed everything. The Hawthorne Ranch sat at the eastern edge of the Sala River Valley, which wasn't famous for anything except good grass, cold winters, and the kind of stubbornness that gets passed down through families like eye color. Bram Hawthorne had homesteaded the land 22 years ago with a second-hand plow and a wife who died of fever when Elowen was 9, and in the years since, he had built something real, not rich. Not impressive by the standards of the big cattle operations that were swallowing up the smaller spreads, but solid. Honest. His. Elowen had grown up on that land the way a tree grows up in rocky soil, shaped by the difficulty of it, roots going deeper than you'd expect just by looking at the surface. She was 27 years old that autumn, and she was, by any accounting, the kind of woman men noticed. Chestnut hair, hazel eyes that shifted color depending on the light, a face that made strangers in town turn around for a second look. She knew it. She had known it since she was 15, and a rancher's son had ridden 6 miles out of his way to leave wildflowers on their fence post, addressed to her beauty and not to her name. She had never found it particularly useful. What she found useful was the leather-bound ledger she kept in the second drawer of her father's desk, which contained 4 years of precise calving records, 2 years of pasture rotation notes, a running account of every dollar the ranch owed, and every dollar it was owed, and enough breeding data to tell you which bloodlines were worth chasing and which would cost you money in the long run. She had built that ledger herself. She had caught 3 bookkeeping errors in her father's records that would have cost them significant money. She had quietly negotiated a better hay price with a supplier 2 valleys over by writing a letter so matter-of-fact and well-reasoned that the man wrote back to say he wished more of his customers thought the way she did. Bram knew all of this. He was proud of her in the private, unspoken way of men who don't know how to say difficult things out loud. He was also the kind of proud that made him protective in ways that sometimes looked, from the outside, like he didn't trust her. When Silas Crowder came through his kitchen door that Tuesday morning, Bram was still out checking fence on the north pasture. He wouldn't be back for another hour, so it was just Elowen and the $40 offer. "You should leave," Elowen said. She didn't raise her voice. She never raised her voice when she was genuinely angry. She had learned early that a quiet tone unsettled people more than shouting did. "My father doesn't accept visitors before 10. Your father doesn't own this conversation," Silas said. He pulled out a chair at the Hawthorne breakfast table, their table, in their kitchen, and sat down in it like he'd been expected. He was 51 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, and now carried too much of everything, too much money, too much comfort, too much certainty that whatever he wanted would eventually find its way to him. He had a ranch that abutted the Hawthorne spread, on the western edge, a lumber interest in the county seat, and a mortgage on at least 3 neighboring properties that Elowen knew about and suspected were the tip of a much larger arrangement. "You're a practical woman," he said. "I've heard that about you. So let me be practical. I'm going to have a conversation with your father eventually, and your father's going to tell me to come back and talk to you, because that's the kind of man Bram is. So I'm cutting out the middle step by offering to buy me, by making an offer for your hand, which is how things are done. $40 isn't how things are done, Elowen said. $40 is how you'd price a saddle. Something moved behind Silas's eyes, not quite anger, not quite amusement, something between the two that was worse than either. 50 then. Elowen picked up her coffee again. Her hand was completely steady. Get out of my father's kitchen, Mr. Crowder. Silas didn't move immediately. He sat there for a moment with his hands flat on the table, looking at her, and in that moment Elowen understood something she had suspected for a long time. The man wasn't used to hearing a woman talk to him this way, and he wasn't going to forget it. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the door. At the threshold he turned. I'll speak to Bram, he said. He's a reasonable man. He is, Elowen agreed. He's also my father. Silas let the door fall shut behind him without a word. Elowen stood in the kitchen for a moment after he left, looking at the table where he'd been sitting, and then she went and got a cloth and wiped down the surface even though there was nothing on it. She was still doing that when her father came in from the north pasture with mud on his boots and a broken fence staple in his hand. Bram Hawthorne was 54, weathered down to the essentials, a man who communicated mostly in silences and occasional two-word sentences that nonetheless managed to convey complete paragraphs. He looked at his daughter's face, then at the cloth in her hand, and understood that something had happened. Crowder was here, Elowen said. Bram set the fence staple on the windowsill. What did he want? He made an offer for what? For me. She looked at her father steadily. He said $50. Started at 40. The silence in the kitchen changed texture. Bram's jaw moved slightly. He set his hat on the hook beside the door, with a deliberateness that was, for him, the equivalent of slamming something. He said that. He sat in your chair and said that. And you told him. I told him to leave. He said he'd talk to you. That you're a reasonable man. Bram looked at the windowsill. He looked at the ceiling. He scratched the back of his neck. These were, Elowen knew, the signs of a man working through something complicated, without any vocabulary adequate to the complexity. He won't get a different answer from me, Bram said finally. I know, Papa, though he'll think he will. He picked up his coffee. He always thinks he will. 3 days later, Colter Wynn rode down the Hawthorne lane on a gray-roan mare named Patience, wearing a blue cotton shirt that had been washed so many times it had gone soft and slightly colorless, like the shirt itself was tired. He had $11 folded in his front pocket. He was 35 years old, ranch hand lean, with the kind of hands that looked too big for the rest of him, until you understood that hands like that were the point. Everything else in a man like Colter Wynn existed to support what those hands could do. He had worked a half-dozen spreads across 2 territories in the past 12 years, always hired on reputation and almost never kept to past a season because he moved on before anyone could offer him more. Not ambition exactly, more like an inability to let himself get comfortable in someone else's life. Now he had $11, 1 horse, no land, and an intention he couldn't quite name clearly even to himself. He tied Patience to the post and knocked on the Hawthorne door like a man who understood he was asking for something. Bram answered. He looked at Colter from the doorway with the specific evaluating silence of a man who has spent 40 years sizing up livestock and has applied those same instincts to people. Wynn, he said, Mr. Hawthorne. Colter took off his hat. I wondered if I might have a conversation. About what? Colter held the hat. About your daughter. The silence was different now, deeper, with edges. Bram studied him for another 5 seconds, which was a long time to be studied. Then he opened the door wider and stepped back. The kitchen was warm. Elowen was at the table with her ledger open, running a column of figures in the margin. She looked up when Colter came in, assessments in the same brief and comprehensive way her father had, and looked back at her ledger without changing her expression. Miss Hawthorne, Colter said, Mr. Wynn. She didn't look up again. Bram sat down. He poured coffee for himself, didn't offer any, and said talk. Colter talked. He was not a smooth man, he knew this about himself. He didn't have the kind of voice that made things sound better than they were, or the face that bought goodwill before any words came out. What he had was a straightforward habit, built over years of practical work, of saying exactly what he meant without dressing it up. He had $11, he said. He had a sound horse and a set of tools and a working knowledge of cattle, fence, timber, and construction. He did not have land or a house. He had heard through the connected tissue of valley gossip that the old Ashwood homestead, 2 miles north, had been abandoned for 4 years, and that Bram Hawthorne held the adjacent deed. He was not asking for anything except to make his situation and his intentions known. Bram listened to all of this with his coffee cup in his hands and no expression on his face. Tensions, Colter said, and then paused, because this was the part that was harder. I would like to court your daughter, Mr. Hawthorne, with her permission, and I want to be honest about what I have and what I don't. Kitchen was very quiet. Then Elowen, without looking up from her ledger, said, Ashwood has a collapsed barn and a roof with 3 missing sections. I know, Colter said. The south fence is down. The well is silted and would need to be cleared. Stove is cracked. I know, she looked up. She had hazel eyes that were currently closer to green, and she looked at him with a direct quality that he wasn't entirely prepared for. You have $11. He didn't know how she knew that. Yes, that won't cover the stovepipe alone. No, ma'am. It won't. She went back to her ledger. How do you intend to manage it? Bit by bit, he paused, and asked when I need to. Something shifted, barely perceptibly, in the set of her shoulders. Not softening exactly. More like she had noticed something and was deciding what to do with it. Bram set his cup down. He had been watching this exchange with the same expressionless attention he'd given everything else, and now he said, Ashwood. Sir, make it livable by winter, Bram said. Roof, barn, well, stove. Livable. He paused, then come back. It was phrased as a condition. A test. The thing a father says when he means, prove yourself worthy of my daughter, and maybe then we'll talk. Colter nodded, because nodding was what you did when Bram Hawthorne spoke to you with that tone. But then he looked at Elowen. She was still looking at her ledger, but he understood she was not reading it. She was listening. Her pen wasn't moving. Miss Hawthorne, he said. I want to be straight with you. She looked up. Your father's conditions are his to set. But if I do this, if I fix that place up, I don't want you to feel like I've earned something. Like the work means you owe me an answer. He turned his hat in his hands. I'll build it because it needs building. And if you want a life there, I'd want to know that was your choice, not a debt. Elowen looked at him for a long moment. Her father looked at the ceiling. All right, she said at last. The word came out careful and measured, like she was testing its weight. All right. Colter left 10 minutes later. He rode Patience back down the lane, and, when he reached the road, he sat there for a moment looking north toward Ashwood, thinking about a collapsed barn and a cracked stove and $11, and trying to work out where to start. He started the next morning. The first week at Ashwood was the kind of week that makes a man take an honest inventory of himself. He spent the first day just walking the property, the whole thing. Every corner, every structure, every problem. He carried a short stick and scratched notes in the dirt as he went, because he didn't have paper. The barn wasn't just collapsed. It had been collapsed for long enough that the wood in the fallen sections had gone soft with rot. The well needed a full clean-out. 2 of the fences were entirely down, and a third was leaning at a degree that meant it would be down before spring. The farmhouse roof had 3 gaps, he'd known that, but when he got up there, he found that the underlying structure had warped from 2 seasons of exposure and would need to be reframed in 2 sections, not patched. The stove was cracked through the firebox, which meant it wasn't a repair, it was a replacement. He sat on the farmhouse steps at the end of that first day and looked at his $11 and looked at the sky. He needed lumber, nails, roofing material, a new stove, pipe for the well clearing, 2 weeks of food to get him through the work, feed for Patience, and he needed all of it before the first serious cold, which in this valley came early and came hard. The math didn't work. He knew the math didn't work. He also understood that he was not going to ride back to Bram Hawthorne and ask for money, because that would mean something he wasn't willing to have it mean. He spent the second day cutting and splitting the usable timber from the fallen barn sections. What was sound he stacked. What was rotted he burned in a controlled pile in the yard. By the end of the day, he had a respectable pile of salvageable lumber and a back that was reminding him he was 35. He spent the third day in town. The county seat was 12 miles east, and he rode it at a trot, arriving dusty and direct. He went to the lumberyard first, and explained his situation in plain language, what he was building, what he had, what he could offer in labor credit. The yard owner, a taciturn man named Hedgepath, looked at him for a while and then offered a partial credit arrangement in exchange for 6 days of yard work over the following month. It wasn't ideal. It was workable. He went to 3 other merchants and negotiated similar arrangements: a hardware man for nails and stovepipe, a feed store for grain, a woman who ran a general goods counter and recognized his name from a job he'd done for her brother-in-law 2 years back, and offered him a reasonable credit on staples based on that alone. He came back to Ashwood with a wagon load, a month of obligations, and the specific exhausted satisfaction of a man who has solved an impossible problem through sheer stubbornness. He was pulling boards from the wagon when he heard a horse on the lane. Elowen arrived on a bay gelding, carrying saddlebags and her ledger strapped flat against them. She dismounted without waiting for an invitation, tied her horse to the post, and walked toward him across the yard. "Came to see the place," she said. "All right." She walked the property the way he had, but faster, with a specific purposefulness, stopping at each problem and looking at it for exactly as long as she needed. She looked at the well. She looked at the barn site. She went inside the farmhouse and came back out again. "You're starting with the roof," she said. It wasn't a question. "Roof first. Barn structure. Well, stove last, because I can work with a fire pit in the yard until the cold comes in." She opened her ledger on the wagon seat. She had already written numbers in it. "Partial credit with Hedgepath," she said. He stared at her. "How do you know about that?" "Hedgepath's wife is my father's cousin." She said it without any particular inflection, just as information. "Your lumber arrangement was the talk of Tuesday's sewing circle by 3 in the afternoon." She ran her pen down a column. "Credit terms are fair. You'll make it back in the yard work. But you're going to be short on the stovepipe fitting." "I know. The hardware man will negotiate down further. His son owes my father a favor from last spring. If you go back Thursday and mention the Hawthorne name, he'll take $2 off the fitting price." Colter leaned against the wagon. "Is that an offer of help?" Elowen looked at him over the ledger. "It's information. What you do with information is your business. Miss Hawthorne." "I also want to tell you something about the farmhouse," she said, moving on before he could finish the sentence. Closed the ledger. "There's a wall on the east side. A good wall, solid framing, no damage. That's where I'd want a window." He waited. "A large window," she said, and her voice shifted, not dramatically, but enough. "Table beneath it. A work table for." She looked at him with the hazel eyes that were gray today, not green, and said, "For everything I do that nobody sees." He didn't respond immediately. He looked at the farmhouse, at the east wall, and he thought about the framing costs and the glass costs and the fact that a window wasn't going to keep anyone warm in February, and he had barely figured out the roof yet. Then he said, "I'll need to know the measurements you want." Something in Elowen's face moved. Not a smile, exactly. Something quieter than a smile. "I'll bring them Thursday," she said. She came back Thursday, with the measurements written in precise fractions in her ledger, and with the information that the hardware man had agreed to $250 off the fitting price when she had spoken to him herself, Tuesday afternoon, which was before she'd said anything to Colter about it. He noticed that. He filed it. The 3rd week of work, Silas Crowder came to Ashwood. Came in a good rig, a surrey with a matched team, which was more carriage than a working man needed for a visit to a ruin, but the excess was the point. He pulled up in the yard while Colter was up on the farmhouse roof, and he stood below and looked up with his hands in his pockets. "Wynn," he said. Colter kept working. "Crowder, heard you'd taken on the old Ashwood place." Silas walked the yard slowly, looking at the lumber stacks, the repaired fence section, the staked-out barn footprint. "Ambitious. Work to do, I'm doing it." "With what? $11 and a credit arrangement from Hedgepath?" Colter drove a nail. "Seems to be working, seems to." Silas stopped below him. The sunlight was behind Silas and in Colter's eyes, which was probably intentional. "I could make this easier for you. Short-term loan, fair rate, enough to cover your materials and feed you through the winter." Colter looked down at him. "What rate?" Silas said a number. It was not a fair rate. It was the kind of rate that meant, in 18 months, Silas would own the improvements on Ashwood and have a legal claim against Colter's labor. No, Colter said. Think about it. Thought about it. He went back to nailing. No. Silas stood there a moment longer. Then he said, more quietly, the Hawthorne girl is beautiful. It's not a question. But beauty doesn't fix a barn. Colter stopped nailing. He turned on the roof slowly and looked down at Silas Crowder with a steadiness that had nothing hot in it, nothing that would get him in trouble later. Just a look. You should probably go, he said. Got work to do. Silas went. But that evening, when Colter sat on the farmhouse steps and rubbed the soreness out of his hands, he turned the visit over in his mind. The rate Silas had quoted wasn't desperate generosity. Trap. And the comment about Elowen wasn't idle, it was a probe, checking to see whether Colter thought of her the same way Silas did. As something beautiful, in need of a provider, he thought about the measurements she'd brought him, the window specifications, the careful columns in her ledger. He thought, that is not a woman who needs a provider. He wasn't entirely sure what that meant for him yet. But he filed it alongside everything else, and in the morning he went back up on the roof. The roof was finished by the last week of September. Then the barn framing. The well took 4 days and was the ugliest, wettest, most miserable job he had done since winter fence work in a territorial blizzard 3 years back. But at the end of it, the well ran clean and cold, which was the only thing that mattered. Elowen came twice a week. She did not announce these visits as anything more than what she said they were. She was in the area. She wanted to see progress. She had information. True. She always had information a better price somewhere, a contact who could help, an observation about how something was being done that suggested, without criticizing, a more efficient approach. Colter started looking forward to Tuesdays and Fridays, in a way he hadn't looked forward to anything in some time. One Tuesday she arrived to find him struggling with the east wall, framing the section where the window would go, because the old studs had been set slightly out of plumb, and correcting them while keeping the existing structure intact was a puzzle he'd been working on for 2 days. She tied her horse and stood beside him, looking at the framing for a minute without speaking. If you sister this stud, she said finally, touching a specific point on the frame, and run a ledger board here, you'll pick up the plumb without losing the original structure. He looked where she was pointing. He had been approaching it differently, trying to re-plumb the existing stud entirely. Her way was faster, simpler, used half the material. Where'd you learn that? He asked. I helped my father rebuild the east wall of our barn when I was 17, she said. He explained everything as he went. He always said I'd need to know it someday. She paused. I don't think he imagined I'd be using it like this. What? She looked at him for a moment, standing in someone else's wall, explaining how to fix it. There was something in that sentence that had weight to it, more than the literal meaning. He let it sit. Sister the stud, he said. Sister the stud, she agreed. He ordered the window glass from the county seat the following week. It was more than he could easily afford. He ordered it anyway. The 4th week, Bram Hawthorne came to Ashwood. Came alone, on his own horse, without announcement, and he walked the property the same way Elowen had methodically, looking at everything. He didn't say much. He looked at the roof. He went inside and checked the new framing. He found the well and looked down it. He stood in front of the staked-out barn and looked at the foundation work. Colter stood a few feet away and let him look, because this was a man doing an assessment, and it was better to let him finish. Finally, Bram turned to him. The window, going in next week, Colter said. Glass is ordered. Big window for a farmhouse. She wants a work table under it. Bram looked at him. A complicated thing moved across his face, the expression of a man confronting something he half knew, but hadn't quite put into words yet. Told you that. First time she came to see the place. Bram was quiet. Then she's been coming. Tuesdays and Fridays. Usually 2-3 hours. Something shifted. Not displeasure, more like a reckoning. She said she was checking on the construction. That's what she said to me, too. Colter met his eyes. She's also been helping me solve problems. She knows things. About building, about suppliers, about which credit arrangements are worth taking and which ones aren't. Bram's jaw moved. He looked at the ground. I know you want to protect her, sir, Colter said. He was careful with his tone, direct but not lecturing, which was a difficult balance with a man like Bram. But I think you know what she can do. I know what she can do. She spent half an hour last Tuesday explaining a framing solution I'd been fighting for 2 days. She was right, it worked, I used it. Bram said nothing. I don't think she wants protection, Colter said. I think she wants somebody who can tell the difference between those two things. The silence lasted long enough that Colter thought he might have said too much. Then Bram said the barn. Framing goes up Monday. You'll need 2 men for the Bents. I know. I was going to ask the Halbert boys. Ask my hand porter instead, Bram said. He's available Monday and he's better. He said it flatly, as a practical suggestion, nothing more. But it was a practical suggestion that meant he was sending help, which was something. Thank you, Colter said. Bram went back to his horse. At the post he paused, didn't turn around, and said, the east window. Put it in before the cold comes. Yes, sir, Bram rode away. Colter stood in the yard and looked at the east wall and thought about what that conversation had cost a man like Bram Hawthorne, who didn't part with words or help or acknowledgement easily. And he thought about Elowen at 17, learning to frame a wall from a father who said she'd need to know it someday, and he thought about a table under a window and sunlight and ledgers. He went and found a piece of charcoal and added the window to his schedule for Thursday. The glass arrived Wednesday. He installed it on Thursday, working carefully because glass did not forgive mistakes, and he could not afford to replace it. When it was in sealed, level, fitted properly in the new framing, he stood back and looked at it. The October morning light came through it at an angle that fell clean and bright across the interior floor, reaching exactly as far as the wall where the table would go. He stood there for a while. When Elowen came Friday morning and walked into the farmhouse and saw the window, she stopped, didn't speak for a moment. She walked toward it slowly and stood in the light, looking out through the glass at the cottonwoods and the lane and the open fields beyond, and the expression on her face was not the smile of someone who got what they wanted. It was older than that. It was the expression of a person who had waited for something a long time and was only now beginning to believe it might actually be real. It's good light, she said. Should hold through the afternoon, he said. Gets it most of the morning, and in spring it'll reach the far wall. She nodded. She was still looking out at the cottonwoods. I'll need the table before the snow, she said. I know. I have the lumber already. She turned around. In the light through the window, her face was clearer than he'd seen it, the particular clarity of morning on something you've been trying to see properly for a long time. Colter Wynn, she said. Ma'am, I want to ask you something plain. All right. When you talked to my father the first time, when you said you'd build this place. She paused. Were you building it to earn me? He thought about that. Could have said no. He wasn't sure no was entirely honest. At first he said, partly. And now? He looked at the window. At the light. At the specific quality of what that frame of glass meant, standing in that particular wall. Now I think I was building it because it needed building, he said. And I think I want you to have a choice about it. Not because I earned one. Because you've earned one. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the cottonwoods moved in the October wind. The light shifted. All right, she said at last. The word came out quiet and deliberate, the same way it had the first time, but with something different underneath it. Something that was not quite an answer and not quite a question, but something in between. Something that meant, I'm still watching, and what I see is starting to matter. She left an hour later. He stood in the east room for a while after she'd gone, looking at the light on the floor. Then he went and got the lumber for the table. The table took him 4 days. He didn't have a proper woodworking setup, no planer, no good joinery tools, just a handsaw, a chisel set with 2 missing sizes, a hand plane that needed sharpening every hour, and the particular kind of patience that comes from having no other option. He used the best boards from the salvaged barn lumber, the ones with tight grain and no checking, and he worked them down slowly, fitting the surface flat enough that a marble wouldn't roll off it. Came out solid, not pretty in the way that furniture from a catalog was pretty. Corners weren't as crisp as he wanted them, and he'd had to piece the top from 3 boards because he didn't have one wide enough, and the joint lines were visible if you looked. But it didn't wobble, and it was the right height for a person sitting at a chair, and the surface was smooth under your palm in the way that mattered, the way that meant you could write on it for hours without your paper catching. He put it under the east window on a Thursday afternoon. Elowen came Friday morning and stood in front of it for a long moment, running both hands along the surface. She didn't say anything right away. She just stood there in the light with her hands flat on the table, looking out the window. "The joint," she said finally. "I know. I didn't have wide enough boards. It won't matter in use." She pulled out one of the two chairs he'd set there and sat down. The light came across her left shoulder and across the ledger she pulled from her bag. She opened it. She set her pen. She looked at the window, then at the page, and then she wrote something. Colter stood in the doorway of the east room and watched and thought, "She's not testing the table. She's deciding if this is real." She wrote for 3 minutes without speaking. Then she closed the ledger. "It's right," she said. "Good." She looked over at him. "Sit down, Mr. Wynn. We need to talk about the money." He sat in the second chair. It was strange. Sitting at the table, it felt like they were enacting something, rehearsing a life, which made him aware of how much he wanted the rehearsal to become something else, and how much he was trying not to let that feeling push him anywhere too fast. Elowen opened the ledger to a page near the middle. She had been tracking his expenses. He realized not just noting them, but organizing them into a proper ledger format, income against outgo, credit arrangements separated from cash payments, with dates and amounts. She'd been doing this, apparently, since the beginning. "You're short," she said. "Not catastrophically, but the well repair came in higher than your first estimate, and the window glass cost more than you told me. You have the barn framing money from my father's hand porter helping, but you've got the lath for the interior walls still to buy, and if the cold comes early, you'll need to heat the place before the stove is paid off. I know. There are 2 ways to manage it." She turned the ledger toward him. 2 columns, each with a sequence of figures. The first way, you go back to Hedgepath for an extension on the lumber credit. He'll give it. You've been reliable. But you'll be working his yard into January, which cuts into the time you'd need to finish the interior. And the second. The second is Silver Crown Ranch. She said it in the particular tone of someone presenting information they know will be resisted. They have a horse. I've heard about the horse. Then you've heard that 3 men have already tried to work with him, and all 3 quit. I've heard that. She looked at him. "I want to try." He sat very still. "The owner is offering good money for anyone who can make Rook manageable," she said. "Not broken, not crushed into submission. Manageable, rideable, handleable, able to be used as a working horse. I've watched that horse from the road twice. He's not vicious. He's frightened. There's a difference." "I know there's a difference," Colter said. "I'm not questioning your read of the horse." "Then what are you questioning?" He looked at the ledger, then at her. "You know what people will say." "People already say things," Elowen said, with a flatness that had weight in it. "They've been saying things about me since I was 15. I don't find it particularly informative." He was quiet. The money would cover the lath, the remaining stove payment, winter feed, and 2 months of food with some left over, she said. "It would take Ashwood through the hard season without you working Hedgepath's yard until January. And if something goes wrong with the horse, then something goes wrong." She met his eyes. "I've been thrown before, Mr. Wynn. I'm still here." He didn't argue further. He understood that she wasn't asking for his permission. She was informing him of a plan, and the fact that she was informing him at all was a kind of courtesy she didn't technically owe him. They weren't married. They weren't promised. She was a woman sitting at a table she'd asked for, in a house she hadn't asked to need, laying out a financial solution to a problem that was his, with a capability he hadn't yet understood the full scope of. "Tell me about how you'd approach him," he said. Something relaxed in her shoulders. "Not by much. I'd spend the first 3 days not touching him at all," she said. "Just being in his space, letting him learn my smell, my movements. I'd bring a book so I have something to do that isn't watching him. Horses know when you're focused on them. It makes them nervous." "You'd bring a book." "I'd probably bring the ledger," she admitted. "I'd get more work done that way." She paused, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "Day 4, I'd introduce the rope. Day 6 or 7, the saddle blanket. Not the saddle, just the blanket. Let him get used to it on his back. Let him understand it's not something that's going to hurt him. And the saddle? Day 10, maybe 11, depending on him. Can't set a schedule with a frightened animal. You follow their signals, not your calendar. Colter leaned back in the chair. The morning light came through the east window and lay across the table between them, across the neat columns of her ledger and the worn wood surface and the space where two people were sitting, deciding how to solve problems together. He had been alone with his problems for 12 years. He had not realized until this moment how tired that was. "All right," he said, "all right, go talk to Silver Crown." She went that afternoon. The Silver Crown Ranch was 6 miles southwest, and its owner was a man named Decker Pell, not unpleasant, not dishonest, just deeply practical in the way of men who had built something through decades of careful calculation and had never had cause to be anything else. He met Elowen in the ranch yard with a polite skepticism that she recognized immediately and didn't bother being offended by. She'd met it all her life. "I've had 3 men try," he said. "Good horsemen. One of them has worked horses for 15 years. "I heard," Elowen said. "What did they do first?" He blinked. "What?" "The 3 men. When they first went in with Rook." "What was their approach?" Pell thought about it. "The first one went in with a rope, standard procedure. Rook went straight to the far corner and stayed there. He roped him from distance. Rook fought the rope for 2 days and the man quit. The second went in slow, spent a morning just sitting on the fence. But when he tried to approach, Rook charged him, didn't make contact, stopped short, but the man lost his nerve after that." "Stopped short," Elowen said. It wasn't a question. She was noting something. The third tried the rope as well, but with more patience. 6 days. On the 7th day, Rook let him get the blanket on, but went sideways when the saddle came out and put the man into the fence rail. Broke his wrist. Was the saddle new? Pell looked at her. "It was. New leather has a smell," Elowen said, strong. "If a horse associates a smell with pain, you've lost half your ground before you start." She looked toward the pen where she could see the horse from where she was, standing a big black gelding, heavy-set through the shoulder, moving restlessly along the fence line. "How old is he?" 6. "Had him since he was 2. What happened at 3 or 4? Pell was quiet for a moment. Previous hand used a tie-down. Too tight. Left a sore. After that, anything near his head made him go sideways. "And the saddle fit?" "As far as I know. May I check it?" He showed her the saddle. She ran her hands along the tree, felt the gullet, checked the angle of the bars. There was a ridge in the flocking on the right side, slight, but enough to create uneven pressure across hours of work. "Here," she said, touching the spot. "He's not just frightened of tack. He's been ridden in equipment that hurt him. Every time someone saddles him, he's waiting for the pain." Pell looked at the saddle, then at her. "Can you fix that?" "The saddle needs a saddler," she said. "The horse needs time." She looked back at Rook. He had stopped at the far end of the pen and was watching her. Not with the white-eyed panic of a fully spooked horse. With a wary, measuring attention. 2 weeks, she said. "Maybe less, maybe a few days more. I won't promise you a date because I don't control the horse." "And your fee?" she told him. He was quiet for a moment, and she understood he was weighing it against the 3 failures. Then he said, "If you make him rideable." "If I make him rideable." "Done," Pell said. She rode back to Ashwood that evening and told Colter. He agreed, she said. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." She dismounted and pulled the saddlebags off her horse. "That Rook isn't vicious. That someone hurt him and now he's waiting to be hurt again." Colter took the saddlebags. Most men would have tried to sell him after 3 failures. "Pell's not careless," she said. "He's just been using the wrong approach." She paused at the farmhouse door. "I want to start Monday. I'll come." She turned. "No. Elowen, if you come, there are 2 people. 2 sets of movements, 2 smells, 2 sources of unpredictability. I need it to be quiet." She met his eyes steadily. "I know you want to be there. I understand why. But this is the wrong thing to do for the horse." He stood with the saddlebags and looked at her. "All right," he said, for the 2nd time in 2 days. She went in. He stood in the yard for a moment, looking at the cottonwoods. He was beginning to understand that all right was the most important thing he could learn to say. The following morning, Silas Crowder came back. This time he came to Ashwood directly, without the pretense of the Surrey, on horseback, which Colter recognized as a deliberate choice come on equal footing, appear less formal, seem more like a neighbor stopping by. The man was not stupid. That was the thing about Silas that made him more troublesome than a simply greedy person would be. He was intelligent about how he applied his greed. Colter was on the barn framing when Silas arrived, and he came down from the bent he was working on, because having a conversation with a man like Silas from 12 feet up was a bad idea in both directions. "Nice progress," Silas said, looking at the barn frame. "Getting there. I heard about the horse arrangement." Silas said it casually, looking at the frame, not at Colter. "Silver Crown, word travels. It does in this valley." He paused. "You're letting her work a dangerous animal to pay your costs." "I'm not letting her do anything," Colter said. "She made a business arrangement." "Pell, not with me. You didn't try to stop her." "I don't own her, Crowder. She's not mine to stop." Silas looked at him then, with that between anger and amusement expression. "She's going to get hurt. That horse has put one man in a fence rail already. She knows the horse better than any of those men did. She's a woman." "That is a fact," Colter said evenly. "That has absolutely nothing to do with whether she can read a horse." Silas shifted. He looked out at the cottonwoods, then back. "My offer stands," he said. "The loan. Better rate than Hedgepath." "Told you no. Your costs are higher than you planned. She's working a dangerous horse to make up the difference. That's a problem a simple loan could solve. The rate you quoted would mean you own these improvements in 18 months, Colter said. I did the arithmetic. Silas's face changed, just slightly a tightening around the eyes. He hadn't expected the arithmetic. You misunderstood the terms. I don't think I did. Colter held the man's gaze. I think you quoted them clearly and expected me to miss it. I didn't miss it. A silence stretched between them. You're going to have a hard winter, Silas said at last. His voice had lost the pleasant neighbor quality. This valley doesn't make it easy on people who try to build something without backing. I've noticed, Colter said. I'm still building. Silas left without the easy tone he'd arrived with, and Colter watched him ride back down the lane and turn onto the road toward his own spread, and thought about what a man does when he's been refused clearly and still doesn't accept it. He didn't like what he thought. Elowen went to Silver Crown Monday. She brought her ledger, a worn copy of a botanical survey she'd been meaning to read for months, a lunch she'd packed for herself, and nothing else. No rope, no tack, nothing that could be misread as a threat. She sat on the top rail of the pen fence for most of the morning, reading. Not watching Rook, letting him watch her. She turned pages at the pace of genuine reading, not the pace of performance, because animals understood the difference. Rook spent the first 2 hours in the far corner. By mid-morning, he had moved to the middle of the pen. By noon, he was 12 feet from the fence rail, watching her with the specific quality of attention that meant he was curious rather than afraid. Not safe curious wasn't safe, and she didn't confuse them. But it was a beginning. She came back Tuesday, Wednesday. She brought different things to read. On Thursday, she brought a small amount of grain in her jacket pocket and ate her lunch sitting on the fence, and at the end of the meal, she let a little grain fall from her fingers onto the fence rail, and then she left. When she arrived Friday morning, the grain was gone. She sat on the fence. After an hour and a half, Rook walked to within 6 feet of her and stopped. She didn't look at him. She kept reading. He stood there for 4 minutes, which she counted in her head. Then he went back to the middle of the pen. That evening, she told Colter. He was at the workbench in the barn, fitting a hinge. She came in and sat on a barrel and described the week matter-of-factly, in the sequence it had happened. 6 feet, he said. 6 feet, approximately, I didn't measure. Good, it's a start. She paused. He's smart. Smarter than they've been giving him credit for. He was evaluating me, working out whether I was a threat. You can see him thinking. Does Pell know how it's going? I give him a report each afternoon. She picked up a wood shaving from the floor and turned it in her fingers. He's surprised I haven't tried to touch him yet. What did you tell him? That patience isn't nothing. That doing nothing deliberately isn't the same as doing nothing. She dropped the shaving. He didn't completely follow that. I follow it, Colter said. She looked at him in the lamplight of the barn. He had oil on his forearm from the hinge fitting and wood dust in his hair, and he was looking at the hinge, not at her. She found, somewhat unexpectedly, that this was easier than being looked at. "There's something else," she said. "What?" "I was talking to Pell's wife, Clara, yesterday afternoon. She said Silas Crowder came to Silver Crown last week, before I made my arrangement." Colter set down the hinge. "For what?" "He offered to buy Rook." "Not a high offer," Clara said. Pell turned him down immediately. The timing, she paused. Silas knew about Rook. He knew Three Fin had failed. He offered to buy the horse right before I came to make my arrangement. "He'd have sold the horse somewhere else," Colter said slowly. "Or used him, had him worked differently, without any attention to why he was frightened. Or he just wanted to take the opportunity away." She looked at him directly. "Either way, he didn't want me to succeed." Colter was quiet for a long moment. Outside the barn, the October night had come in cold and clear, and the cottonwoods were audible in the wind, that dry rattling of autumn leaves. "He's not going to stop," Colter said. "No." She stood up from the barrel. "Means we need to not make mistakes." She walked to the barn door and stopped. "Mr. Wynn." "Ma'am, are you keeping records of his visits?" "What he said." "Dates and times." He hadn't been. He'd been tracking everything about the construction, but not that. "I'll start," he said. "Good." She pulled her coat closed. "Keep them somewhere he can't get to them." She walked back to her horse in the darkness, and he stood in the barn door watching her go, and thought about a man who tries to buy a horse just to close a door, and understood that Silas Crowder had been thinking about this, longer and more carefully than either of them had been thinking about him. He went inside and found a piece of paper and wrote down the date and time of both of Silas's visits, and what had been said, as precisely as he could remember it. He wrote it in the margin of the lumber inventory he kept in his coat pocket, which was the only paper he had on him. 2 days later, he put it in the ledger. Not his ledger. Elowen's. Because she was right, it needed to be somewhere Crowder couldn't easily get to it. The second week of November brought the first real cold, not the killing freeze, but the warning cold, the kind that told you to check your woodpile and your roof and your food stores, the kind that turned the ground hard an inch down and made your breath visible at 6 in the morning. Colter had the lath up on the interior walls and the stove installed and drawing well. He had 3 cords of wood split and stacked. He had winter feed arranged for patients through a trade arrangement with a rancher 2 miles east who needed a section of fence repaired before the freeze. His food stores were thin but adequate. He was not comfortable, but he was not in trouble. He was also beginning to admit to himself quietly, alone in the farmhouse at night, that the arrangement he had with Elowen, these twice-weekly visits, the ledger, the practical partnership of solving problems together, was not enough for him, and that the feeling it was not enough was something he had to be very careful with. She was not his. She had not promised him anything. She had sat at a table in the light of an east window and done her work, and she had helped him solve problems because she was capable and because she found his stubbornness compatible with her own. That was not a promise. That was not a commitment. And yet, he thought about the window measurements she'd brought him, specificity of them, the way she had come back Tuesday and set her pen on the surface and started writing like the table had been waiting for her. He thought about the way she said, "all right," when he got something right, in the particular flat tone that meant she approved, but wasn't going to make a production of it. He was 35 years old, and he had spent 12 years not letting himself want anything he couldn't carry on one horse. He was running out of reasons to keep doing that. Brooke let her touch his neck on the 10th day. She'd been standing beside the fence rail, not on it, with her hand resting on the top board, and he had come to the rail and sniffed at her jacket pocket, where she sometimes kept grain, and found it empty. He stood there looking at her with a direct dark eye. Then he dropped his nose and bumped it against her hand. She didn't move. She didn't reach up. She let him bump her hand again, and then she slowly turned her palm up, open, empty, and he sniffed it, and then he pressed his forehead against the back of her hand and stayed there. She stood perfectly still and let him. Pell was watching from the yard. When she came out of the pen 20 minutes later, he said, 12 years I've been around horses. I've never seen that. He needed someone to wait, she said. I sent 3 men in. They went into work, she said, not unkindly. He needed someone to come in without wanting anything. That's a different thing to be. Pell looked at her with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man recalibrating, taking in information that doesn't fit the category he'd put you in, and not quite knowing where to put you now. She was used to that expression. It was better than the previous one. She introduced the rope on day 12. Not to catch him, she looped it loose over the fence rail and let it sit there for an hour while she read, so it was just part of the landscape. Rook investigated it at his own pace, sniffed it, walked away from it, came back to it. By the end of the hour, he was stepping over it deliberately, not around it. The saddle blanket came on day 14. She laid it over the fence rail the way the rope had been, and then after an hour, she draped it over her own shoulders like a cape and walked around the pen wearing it, being just a person with a strange thing on her back, until he had decided that the blanket wasn't threatening. Then she laid it across his back, briefly, and took it off. He didn't move. She did it again. He shifted once, forward, then settled. She came out of the pen that day with her heart going faster than it should have been, which she did not show. Colter was waiting by the road when she came out of Silver Crown, sitting on a fence post 200 yards down with his hat in his hands. He wasn't watching the ranch, he was looking at the sky, as if he'd happened to stop there, which fooled neither of them. "How'd it go?" he said. "Blanket," she said, both sides. He looked at her. Already he was ready. She mounted her horse. "Don't look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like you're surprised." She settled into the saddle. "Told you he wasn't vicious. I believed you." "You believed me with your mouth," she said. "You're believing me with your face now. Those are different things." He put his hat on. Fair enough. They rode back toward Ashwood together in the gathering dark, and neither of them pointed out that they had been riding the same direction home for weeks now, or that it had stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like something else entirely. Cottonwoods were bare by then. The sky above the valley was the particular deep blue of a cold November evening, and their breath showed, and their horses moved together at an easy pace. "The saddle is next," she said. "When?" "Few days." She looked at the road. "Pell's having it refitted. The flocking was wrong on the right side." He didn't know. "Is that why?" "Part of why. The rest is the history the horse has with tack. But you fix what you can fix." She paused. "That's generally the correct approach." Colter looked at her profile in the fading light, at the particular set of her jaw that meant she was thinking about something bigger than what she was saying. "Are we talking about the horse?" he asked. A pause. "We're talking about the horse," she said. But the pause had been long enough that they both understood that they were not entirely talking about the horse. They came to the Ashwood lane, and she turned her horse to continue toward her father's place, and he stopped Patience at the gate. "Elowen," he said. She stopped. "Thank you," he said. "For all of this." He meant the table, the ledger, the hedge path information, the Silver Crown arrangement, the records she was keeping in her book. He meant the Tuesdays and Fridays and the east wall framing solution. He meant everything that had accumulated over these weeks, that he didn't have a word for yet. She sat on her horse for a moment in the cold November dusk, and she didn't say "you're welcome," because that would have been less than what it was. "The table was a good idea," she said. "It was your idea." "Yes," she said, "it was." And she rode on, and he watched her go until the dusk took her. And then he went inside to where the stove was warming the farmhouse, for the first time since autumn started, and the lamplight fell through the east window, and the table sat under it, solid and imperfect and completely real. He built a fire. He sat in the second chair for a while, the empty one, looking at the dark window. He was building something. He knew that. He just wasn't entirely sure yet what shape it was going to take, or whether he was building it right, or whether a man with $11 and one horse and a salvage table had any business hoping it would be enough. Outside, the first flakes of early-season snow began to fall on Ashwood, quiet and indifferent, the way weather always is about the things people have decided to want. The snow that had started falling on Ashwood that November evening didn't amount to much 2 inches, gone by noon the next day, leaving only the mud and the cold and the particular gray light of a valley settling into winter. But it reminded everyone who lived there of what was coming, and people who lived by land and weather don't need reminding twice. Colter spent the first week of November finishing the interior lath, sealing the window frame against draftost with oakum and a careful beat of pitch, and splitting the last cord of wood to finish out his winter stack. The work was the mechanical kind, the kind that lets your hands do the knowing while your mind goes somewhere else, and his mind kept going to the same places. The ledger in Elowen's bag, the records he'd been keeping of Silas's visits. The refitted saddle that Pell's saddler had returned to Silver Crown on Thursday, with the flocking evened out on the right side. He was not a man who worried efficiently. He worried in circles, coming back to the same points, looking at them from slightly different angles, finding that they were still the same points. What worried him most was not the money, though the money was thin. What worried him was Silas Crowder's patience. A man who bought mortgages on neighboring properties, who appeared at the right moments with loan offers he knew would be refused, who tried to buy a horse simply to close a door, that was not a man acting on impulse. That was a man with a plan that unfolded over months, not days, and that kind of patience was harder to defend against than simple aggression, because you couldn't see all of it at once. He mentioned this to Elowen on a Tuesday, sitting at the table under the east window while she reviewed his records of Silas's visits. "He's been to my father twice," she said, without looking up from the page. "I didn't know about the second visit until yesterday. Clara Pell mentioned it. Silas's wife and my father's housekeeper play cards on Thursdays. What did he want? To talk about the Ashwood boundary." She turned the page. "There's an old survey line between your property and ours. The Ashwood deed references a spring, the Sala Head Spring, as a boundary marker. My father's deed references the same spring as part of his eastern boundary. Depending on which survey you use, the spring might belong entirely to one property, or sit on the line between them." Colter set down his coffee. "How long have you known this?" "I found it in my father's deed records 3 weeks ago." She looked up. "I didn't say anything, because I was still working out what it meant. And now? Now I think Silas knows about it and is trying to use it." She laid the page flat. "The Ashwood Spring feeds roughly a third of the water your cattle would use in a dry summer. If Silas could establish legal control of that spring, either by purchasing the adjoining parcel or by finding a survey interpretation that gives it to existing land he holds a mortgage on, he'd have leverage over this place that no loan refusal could undo." The kitchen was very quiet. "He holds a mortgage on something adjacent," Colter said. "Teller parcel, 40 acres on the north side." She said it steadily. "He's held the mortgage for 2 years. Teller is behind on payments." Colter looked at the table. He looked at the east window, at the winter pale light coming through it. He thought about Silas sitting in this kitchen before he'd ever arrived, offering $40 for Elowen's hand like she was a saddle. "What do we do?" he said. "We establish the correct survey." She pulled a second sheet from her ledger. She had been doing this the whole time, he realized, carrying documents inside the ledger, so that they looked like nothing more than a woman with her accounting. "I wrote to the Territorial Land Office 2 weeks ago. I asked for a copy of the original survey plat for the Ashwood parcel and the Hawthorne eastern boundary. They'll take 3 weeks to respond. That's cutting it close. Which is why I also wrote to a surveyor in the county seat." She set the sheet down. "His name is Aldrich Pine. He's done work for my father before. He's thorough, and he doesn't take money from people who want results rather than truth, which is rarer than it should be." She paused. "He'll come out next week. We need both of you to walk the line together. Both of us. You and my father." She looked at him evenly. "I know that conversation is difficult. Have it anyway." He looked at her. "My father isn't your enemy," she said. "He's a man who doesn't say things easily. That's not the same as opposition. He set conditions. He also sent Porter to help with the barn vents," she said. "And he told you to put the window in before the cold came. Those were not the actions of a man who wants you to fail." She closed the ledger. "He's watching how you handle difficulty. So am I." He didn't answer immediately. "I'll talk to him," he said. "Good." She stood up and pulled on her coat. "I'm going to Silver Crown. The saddle goes on today." He looked up sharply. "You're not coming," she said before he could offer. "Same reason as before, I know." He stood. "Be careful." Paused at the door. The word careful sat between them, with a weight that neither of them acknowledged directly, because in acknowledging it would mean naming what it meant to him if something went wrong, and they weren't at that part of the conversation yet. "I'm always careful," she said. "I'm just also willing to do things that look dangerous from the outside." She left, and he stood in the kitchen for a moment, and then he put on his coat and went to saddle Patient Soft and ride to the Hawthorne Ranch to have a conversation he'd been circling for 2 months. Bram was in the barn when Colter arrived, working over a piece of harness with a punch and a length of new stitching leather. He looked up when Colter came in and then went back to the harness. He didn't say anything. Colter had learned in 2 months of this that Bram's silences were not unfriendly. They were the silence of a man who found most talk unnecessary and was waiting to see if this was the kind of talk that would prove him right. "There's a boundary question," Colter said. Bram kept working. "Ashwood Spring. You knew. Found it in my deed records last month." He punched a hole. "Elowen found it first." He said it without any particular inflection, but the information was precise. He knew what his daughter had been doing, and he wasn't surprised. "Crowder's been poking at the Teller parcel," she told me. "She tell you Teller's planning to sell?" Colter went still. "No. Teller came to me last week." Bram set down the punch. "Wants to sell outright rather than keep fighting the mortgage. He's got family in Kansas, wants to go." He looked at Colter directly. "He'll sell to Crowder if no one else makes an offer." "What's the price?" Bram said a number. It was not a large number for land, which meant it was a number that Crowder had probably helped arrive at through the mortgage pressure. It was also a number that was completely outside Colter's ability to pay. "I don't have that," Colter said. "I know you don't." Bram picked up the harness again. "I'm thinking about it." Colter understood what that meant. Bram buying the Teller parcel would put the spring question in a different position, 2 neighboring family properties rather than 1 family, and Crowder. It wouldn't solve the survey question, but it would change the character of the problem. "That's your decision," Colter said carefully. "Not mine to ask." "No." Bram's needle went through the leather. "But if I buy it and the survey comes back wrong on the spring, we've all got a problem. If I buy it and the survey is right, we've contained him." He looked up. "You contacted a surveyor, Elowen Pine." "Good man." He went back to the stitching. "Bring him Friday." "I'll walk the line with you." "Yes, sir." Bram sewed 3 more stitches in silence. Then, without looking up, "She's at Silver Crown today." "Yes." "The saddle." "Yes." Bram was quiet. His needle went in and out of the leather with the patience of a man who had been doing this for decades. "She used to work our difficult horses when she was young," he said. "Before I understood what she was doing, I thought she was just being stubborn, going in with animals the hands had given up on." He paused. "She never got hurt. I got scared twice watching her." "She was never scared." Colter didn't say anything. He understood this wasn't a conversational exchange. It was a man handing over information he'd been carrying alone. "I thought I was protecting her," Bram said, "when I set the condition. The house, the winter." He set the harness down on his knee. "I think maybe I was protecting myself from having to watch her go somewhere I couldn't follow." The barn was very still. "She needs the survey results," Colter said. Not because it was the right thing to say in response to what Bram had just told him, but because it was the thing Bram needed to hear next, that the conversation was still about practical things, that neither of them was going to be embarrassed by the truth that had just passed between them. Bram picked up the harness. "Friday," he said. "Friday," Colter said. He rode back to Ashwood and waited. At Silver Crown, Elowen stood inside the pen with the refitted saddle draped over the top rail, where it had been sitting for 40 minutes. Rook had approached it twice, sniffed it. The new leather smell was still present, but she'd worked a little used oil into the surface that morning to dull the sharpness of it, and the horse hadn't reacted with the wide-eyed alarm that the previous saddle had triggered. She lifted it off the rail slowly, holding it at her side, letting it hang visible rather than hiding it behind her body. She walked with it to the middle of the pen and set it on the ground. Then she stepped back and waited. Rook watched. He came forward after 7 minutes, she counted, and sniffed the saddle thoroughly, circling it, poking his nose under the skirt, investigating the cinch. He pulled back once when the cinch rings swung and caught the light. He came back. Elowen picked up the saddle. She placed the blanket on his back. Stood. She showed him the saddle held it at his shoulder level, let him sniff the tree. Then she placed it on his back. He moved forward 2 steps. Stopped. She let it sit there unsecured. Just the weight of it. Just what it felt like. He turned his head and looked at her with one dark eye, and then looked forward again, and she thought, there it is. That's the moment. When they decide you're not going to hurt them. She reached under and brought up the cinch and buckled it loosely, not working tension, just secure, and stepped back. Brooke stood completely still. Pell, watching from outside the rail, said nothing, which was the right thing to do. She walked Rook around the pen on a loose lead for 20 minutes with the saddle on his back, and he moved evenly and quietly. And at the end of it, she unbuckled the cinch and lifted the saddle off, and he turned and bumped her shoulder with his nose. She came out of the pen with her hands steady and her heart not steady at all. That's the furthest anyone's gotten with him, Pell said. He's ready, she said. 2 more days with the saddle, letting him get used to the feel and the movement. Then I ride. Pell looked at the horse, who was now standing at the water trough with complete disinterest in everything that had just happened. He's a different animal. He's the same animal, Elowen said. He's just not scared anymore. She said it simply, like it was a small thing. It was not a small thing. She knew it, and Pell knew it, and the way he looked at her in that moment was the look of a man who has had a category revised without quite knowing how to update the filing system yet. She rode home in the cold afternoon and told Colter what had happened. He listened from the barn doorway, leaning against the frame, and when she finished, he said, 2 more days. 2 more days, and then you ride him, and then I ride him. He nodded. He looked at the ground for a moment, and she knew he was working through the part of himself that wanted to say something protective, and she waited while he worked through it, and when he looked up, he just said, all right. She had started to understand that all right, when Colter said it, was not surrender. It was a man making a deliberate choice to trust something bigger than his own worry. That was, she had decided, a harder thing to do than most people gave it credit for. Pine comes Friday, she said. Your father and I will walk the line with him. She looked at him. You talked to him this morning. She was quiet for a moment. How did it go? He sewed harness the whole time and told me to come Friday, Colter said. She considered this. That's good, I thought so. She turned to go, then stopped. He told you something. Colter looked at her. He told me about Teller wanting to sell. It's not what I mean. She turned around fully. He said something about me, something he doesn't say. He held her gaze. He said he thought he was protecting you. With the condition, the house. She looked away, out across the bare field in the winter sky. He protected me my whole life, she said. From hardship, from bad marriages, from men who saw my face and not much else. He did a good job of that. A pause. He didn't know he was also protecting the world from seeing what I could do. I know, Colter said. He knows now, she said, not a question. Statement of fact. He knows now, Colter confirmed. She nodded once, briefly, the way she nodded when a calculation came out correctly. Then she mounted and rode back toward the Hawthorne spread, and Colter watched her go in the gray November afternoon, and thought about a man sewing harness in a barn and a daughter who had been learning to frame walls at 17, because her father said she'd need to know it someday. And all the things people teach each other without meaning to, and all the things they fail to see until something makes them look directly at it. Aldrich Pine arrived Friday morning on a mule with a transit and a chain and a leather case of maps that looked like they'd survived 2 decades of exactly this kind of work. He was 60 compact. With spectacles, he kept pushing up his nose and a habit of walking the ground before he said anything about it, like the land deserved to be consulted first. Colter and Bram walked the eastern boundary line with him, from the northeast corner south to the spring, which was a modest thing, a seep coming up through limestone, cold and clear, pooling in a natural depression about the size of a wagon bed before running south in a thin channel. It didn't look like much. It was everything in a dry summer. Pine set up his transit, ran his chain, consulted the plat he'd pulled from the territorial office records and the copy of the Ashwood deed that Elowen had sent him 2 weeks earlier, and then he walked the line twice more without saying anything. The original survey, he said finally, addressing both of them, uses this cottonwood as the corner marker. He indicated a tree about 30 feet north of the spring. Cottonwood is clearly identified in the original plat double trunk. Distinctive, has been here long enough that it appeared in the 1871 land record as an existing tree. He looked at his notes. The boundary runs from this tree on a bearing of south 17 degrees east. He paused. At that bearing, the spring falls 18 feet west of the line. Meaning it's on the Ashwood parcel, Colter said. Meaning it's entirely on the Ashwood parcel. Yes. He pushed his spectacles up. Any survey interpretation that places the spring on a line or on the adjacent parcel would require ignoring the Cottonwood marker, which is the most clearly identified fixed point in the original plat and has documentary corroboration going back 15 years. Bram was looking at the spring. He had not said anything for the past hour. If I asked you to put that in writing, Colter said. That's what I do, Pine said mildly. You'll have a written report with the transit readings and plat references within 2 weeks. Certified. He paused. If anyone tries to challenge this in a territorial court, the documentation is sufficient to resolve it. He looked at Bram. You're the adjacent holder. I am, Bram said. Your deed's boundary references a spring adjacent to the Ashwood Eastern line, Pine said. That's consistent with the survey. The spring is on Ashwood. Your line is adjacent to it. He closed his leather case. There's no genuine ambiguity here. There's only the appearance of ambiguity if someone chooses to read the deed selectively. Colter looked at Bram. Bram was still looking at the spring. The Teller parcel, Bram said. I intend to make Teller an offer this week, Colter said. He had been thinking about this since Tuesday. He didn't have the money, but Elowen's silver crown payment, once it came, combined with what he had in reserve and a short honest arrangement with the county land bank, not Silas's terms. Something straightforward and documented would get him there. Barely. He had done the arithmetic 3 times. Bram looked at him. You don't have to do that, Colter said. I know it's your decision. But I'd rather solve this myself if I can. Can you? Maybe. He looked at the spring. I'd need 30 days. Bram was quiet. Then I'll hold off on my offer, 30 days. It was not a gift. It was a reasonable extension from one practical man to another, in the full understanding that if Colter failed to manage it, Bram would make his own offer, and the spring would be protected regardless. It was also, Colter understood, another form of trust. They walked back to the farmhouse with Pine, who took coffee and left within the hour, and Bram stood for a moment in the Ashwood yard looking at the house, at the repaired barn, at the woodshed, and the stacked cords, at the winter-sealed window on the east wall. She comes Tuesdays and Fridays, Bram said. She does. I know, Bram said, and that was all he said about it. He mounted and rode home. 3 days later, the valley gathered at Silver Crown. It hadn't been planned as a gathering words, simply traveled, the way word does in places where people live close enough to share weather. Pell had mentioned to a neighbor that the Hawthorne girl was going to ride rook that afternoon. The neighbor mentioned it to 2 others. By the time Saturday morning arrived, there were 14 people in and around the Silver Crown yard, with more drifting up the road as the hour approached. Some of them had come because they'd heard about the horse and were genuinely curious. Some of them had come because they'd heard a woman was going to try it and expected to see something go wrong. Some of them were the kind of people who show up wherever something might happen, because they'd rather see failure up close than miss it. Elowen arrived at Silver Crown and found the yard half full of people and said nothing about it to Pell except, I'd appreciate if they stay back from the rail. I'll manage it, he said. Thank you. She went to the pen alone. Colter was there, standing at the far end of the yard with his hat in his hands. He had not been invited to come. He had come anyway, which was the honest answer, and she had looked at him when she arrived and given him a look that said she knew exactly why he was there. And it wasn't for the horse. She didn't tell him to leave. She brought Rook out of his stall. Herself he came willingly, which several people in the yard remarked on, because they had heard what Rook was like, and she tacked him in the open yard where everyone could see. Not for the audience, because she'd already saddled him in the pen, and she wanted this to be different. She wanted him to understand that the saddle happened in different places, and was still the same safe thing. He stood while she tacked him. He turned his head once and nosed at her shoulder. Someone in the crowd said something about how she'd probably drugged the animal. It was said not quite quietly enough to be private. Colter heard it and looked at the man who'd said it and then looked away, because Elowen didn't need him to respond to that, and responding to it would make it bigger than it was. She led Rook to the mounting block. The crowd went quieter. She stepped into the stirrup slowly, let him feel her weight before she swung up, and when she settled into the saddle, she sat very still and let him feel that too. He shifted his weight once, forward and back, like he was checking that his legs still worked the way he expected. Then he stood. She asked him forward with the lightest possible leg aid, not a kick, not a squeeze, just a breath of pressure. He walked. Around the pen they went, quietly, evenly, with a steadiness that didn't look like submission and didn't look like fear. It looked like two things that had worked something out between them and were now doing the work they'd agreed to. The crowd was watching with a particular attention of people who have come expecting one thing and are getting another. Halfway around the second circuit, it happened. A gate latch on the far side of the yard, not the pen gate. The yard gate swung loose in a gust of wind and struck the post with a crack like a gunshot. Metal on dry wood, sharp and sudden, Rook exploded sideways. Not a full bolt, but a hard, violent spook, 2 full strides sideways and a drop of the hindquarters, the instinctive lurch of an animal whose body decided danger before its mind had the chance to check. The crowd moved. Several people rushed forward. A woman made a sound. Elowen was still in the saddle. She had not grabbed the horn. She had not yanked the reins. She was sitting where she'd been sitting, slightly displaced by the movement, but in the saddle, reins soft, weight centered. She said, "Easy, Rook." Her voice was the same as it had been all along, the same voice she'd used in the pen for 2 weeks. The same voice he'd come to understand meant nothing is coming for you. Rook heard it. He stopped. All 4 feet planted, head up, ears going in 4 directions at once, but stopped. Breathing hard, trembling slightly in the shoulder. Elowen sat there and let him tremble. She said easy again, and then nothing. Pell's yard hand reached the gate and latched it. The metal settled. Rook's breathing slowed. His ears moved forward. Elowen asked him forward again. He walked. The crowd didn't make a sound for a full 5 seconds after that. Then someone started clapping slow at first. 1 person, and then several, and then the whole yard. Colter stood at the back of the crowd, with his hat still in his hands, and watched her bring Rook around the pen at a steady walk. And the applause was for a woman who had just done something that 3 men had failed to do. And nobody in the yard at that moment was talking about how she looked. They were talking about what she had done. He put his hat on. He found Pell at the yard fence. "Your horse is sound," he said. "My horse is better than sound," Pell said. He was watching Elowen bring Rook to the mounting block and dismount, carefully, the way she'd mounted. She told me he wasn't vicious. I believed it about 80%. Now I believe it 100%. "She told you 17 days ago," Colter said. "She did." Pell glanced at him. "I'm slow sometimes." Elowen unsaddled Rook and returned him to his stall, and when she came out of the barn, she was carrying the saddle, and her expression was the expression of someone who has finished a job that needed doing and is thinking about the next job. Not triumphant, not relieved in a showy way. Just done. Colter took the saddle from her because it was heavy and she'd been carrying it, and she let him, which he understood was not something she did easily. Stood in the yard. Some of the people who'd been watching came over to speak to her. Pell introduced her to 2 ranchers who'd ridden over from the far side of the valley, and one of them, a heavy-set man named Garfield, with a spread 3 times the size of Silver Crown, said he had 2 horses that had given him trouble for a year, and asked, directly and seriously, if she was available for hire. Told him she was. She said she worked by the horse, not by the day, and her terms were reasonable and non-negotiable. Garfield agreed on the spot. Pell paid her in the yard in cash and shook her hand with the handshake of a man who has recalibrated and is not embarrassed to show it. When the crowd had mostly cleared, she and Colter walked to where she'd tied her horse. "Garfield," he said, "I know, that's a significance." "I know." She untied the reins. She was quiet for a moment. When the gate went, "I saw. I didn't know I was going to stay on," she said. Came out plainly, factually. "I thought I might not. It was that sudden. But you did, but I did." She looked at him. "I said easy because it was the right thing to say, not because I was calm." "I was not calm." You looked calm. That's the work, she said. Learning what to show and what to keep. She put her foot in the stirrup. It's the same with people. She mounted. He handed her the reins. And for a moment they were close together in the cold afternoon light of the Silver Crown yard, with the empty pen behind them and the sound of the last few departing horses and the smell of winter coming in on the wind. Elowen, he said. She looked down at him. The survey came back right, he said. Spring is on Ashwood. Pine's writing it up. She closed her eyes for just a moment. Relief, real relief, moving through her face before she put it back where she kept things. Tell her, I'm going to make him an offer. 30 days with your father holding off. He paused. I have the Silver Crown payment. I'll talk to the county land bank. The rate, better than Silas. She looked at him with her ledger-reading expression, precise and evaluating. You did the arithmetic. 3 times, he said. What did it come out to? Tight, he said, but workable. Show me the numbers tonight, she said. I'll tell you if you're right. All right. She gathered the reins, stepped back. She was about to turn her horse when she stopped. What you said, she said, about the teller parcel. That you'd rather solve it yourself if you can. Yes. My father heard that. I know. So did I, she said. She rode out of the Silver Crown yard, and he stood there in the cold afternoon watching her go, and thought about a woman who had just stayed in a saddle when most people would have come off it, and said easy in a voice that meant it, and told him afterward that she hadn't been calm, and the difference between those two things, between what you keep and what you show, and how much it meant that she had let him see the side of it just now. He walked to where he'd tied Patience and untied her and stood for a moment in the quiet of the cleared yard. Pen was empty. The gate was latched. Somewhere inside the Silver Crown barn, Rook was in his stall, probably eating, one session at a time, turning something frightened into something trusted. He thought about that. Then he mounted up and rode back toward Ashwood, where the table sat under the east window, and the stove was keeping the house warm, and the ledger, with his notes, and his numbers sat in the second drawer, waiting to be checked by someone who would tell him plainly whether his arithmetic was right. He was starting to understand that this was what it felt like to not be alone with your problems. He was also starting to understand that he didn't want to go back to the other thing. Cold was settling in hard by the time he reached Ashwood, and the sky above the cottonwoods was the slate gray of a valley committed to winter now. He put Patience in the barn and forked hay and checked the water, and when he came out, the first star was visible in the east above the ridge. Elowen arrived 40 minutes later, tied her horse and came in without knocking, which she had started doing, sometime in the last 2 weeks, without either of them remarking on it, and she sat down at the table and took the ledger from her bag and said, "Show me the numbers." He sat in the other chair and showed her the numbers. She went through them the way she went through everything thoroughly, without rushing, asking 2 questions that he hadn't thought to ask himself, catching one arithmetic error that would have come to him more than he'd planned for. Here, she said, pointing to the error. He looked at it. Carrying error, easy to do at the end of a long column. She didn't say it critically, just factually. What does it change? $6, which means your margin is thinner than you thought, but still there. She recalculated the column in the margin. You can make the teller offer. You'll have 70 days before you need to make the first payment, and if the second Garfield horse pays on the same terms as Silver Crown, you'll meet it. If. She looked at him. Garfield shook my hand. He's a straight man. I think it's close to certain. A pause. I'd say 90%. And the 10. The 10% is everything we can't see from here. She closed the ledger. Plan for 90 and prepare for 10. That's all you can do. That's all anyone can do, he said. Yes, she said. It is. She didn't leave right away. She sat at the table in the lamplight while the stove worked, and the cold pressed at the east window, and the cottonwoods moved outside in the dark. And they talked about the survey and the teller timeline and the shape of the spring once Pine's report came back certified. They talked about Garfield's horses and what she knew of them from reputation. One was an Arab cross with spook issues, the other a draft that had gone sour from bad handling. She talked through her thinking on both of them. They talked about Silas Crowder and what the survey result would mean for his position. Elowen thought he'd look for another angle. Colter agreed. They talked about what that angle might be and wrote down 3 possibilities and wrote down a response to each one, and it went into the ledger beside the records of his visits. At some point, the conversation became something else, not practical, not strategic, just 2 people sitting at a table in a warm house, talking about things that had nothing to do with the problem in front of them. He told her about a ranch job he'd had in New Mexico territory 3 years back, with a foreman who communicated entirely in profanity and somehow made it affectionate. She told him about a summer she'd spent at 15 cataloging her father's breeding records and finding, buried in the old records, a lineage note that proved their best mare was worth 3 times what they'd been told. "Your father knew?" he asked. "He knew when I showed him," she said. He hadn't known before. "What did he say?" He said, She looked at the table. Then he sat down and looked at the records for an hour. Then he said, "Good," and went back to work. "High praise," Colter said. "From him, yes." She was quiet for a moment. "He never said I was wrong to look." That was the thing. He just didn't think to ask me to. Stove settled. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods. "I should go," she said. "It's late," he agreed. She stood and pulled on her coat and stood at the table for a moment, looking at the closed ledger. You stayed on that horse today," he said. She looked at him. When the gate went, he said, "You stayed on. I told you I didn't know I would." "I know what you told me." He held her gaze. "I'm telling you what I saw." Which was a woman who knew what to say and said it, and stayed on. She looked at him for a long moment. "Good night, Mr. Wynn," she said. "Good night," he said. She went out, and he listened to her horse move down the Ashwood Lane, and then sat in the quiet of the farmhouse, with the lamp and the stove and the ledger, on the table that he built out of salvaged barn wood with a handplane that needed sharpening every hour, and thought, "I am 35 years old, and I have been a long time arriving here." He didn't know yet what here was going to become, but he was not leaving. Pine's written report arrived on a Thursday, 12 days after he'd walked the boundary line with Colter and Bram. It came by mail rider from the county seat, folded inside a heavy envelope with the surveyor's seal pressed into the wax. And it said exactly what Pine had said standing at the spring. The boundary was clear. The cottonwood marker was unambiguous. The spring sat 18 feet west of the line on Ashwood ground, and any contrary interpretation would require ignoring documented fixed points that had been in the territorial record for 15 years. Colter read it twice at the kitchen table, then folded it and put it in Elowen's ledger, which was the safest place he had. That same afternoon, he rode to see Teller. Jonas Teller was 58, a thin, tired man who had been fighting the mortgage on his 40 acres for 2 years and had run out of fight. He lived in a small house on the north end of his parcel, with a dog and a habit of looking at everything like he was already calculating what it would cost him. He received Colter on his porch, without warmth but without hostility, which was about what the situation warranted. "You know why I'm here," Colter said. "Crowder told me someone else might come." Teller looked at the yard. "Didn't say who. Has he made you an offer, formal offer, week ago?" "The number's fair enough, given what I owe him." Teller said it without bitterness. Just the flat delivery of a man who has accepted that fair enough is what he's going to get. He wants the parcel by December 1st. That was 22 days away. "I'll match his number," Colter said. "Cash within 10 days, he paused. "And I'll need you to hold off signing anything with Crowder until I've had that time." Teller looked at him directly for the first time. "You have that kind of cash." "I will in 10 days. "How?" "An arrangement with the county land bank," Colter said. "Legitimate, documented. I can show you the terms if you want." Teller was quiet. The dog came out from behind the house and sat down beside him and looked at Colter with the specific expression of a working dog evaluating a stranger. "Why do you want this parcel?" Teller said. "It's not much." "It's adjacent to Ashwood," Colter said, "and Crowder wants it, which tells me it's worth more than it looks." Teller almost smiled at that. Almost. Can't argue with the logic. He looked out at his north fence, which was down in 2 places. 10 days. 10 days. If you don't have the cash in 10 days, I sign with Crowder and we're done." "Understood." Teller nodded once, the nod of a man closing a calculation. 10 days, he said again, and went inside. Colter rode directly from Teller's to the county land bank, which kept an office in the county seat above a hardware store. run by a man named Ferris, who had the careful eyes of someone who had been lied to professionally for 20 years and had developed a reliable method for determining when it was happening. Colter laid out his situation plainly: the Ashwood improvements, the Silver Crown payment he'd received, and the Garfield payment that was coming, the survey results, spring, the teller parcel, and why it mattered. He showed Ferris the arithmetic, which Elowen had checked and corrected, and Pine's written report. Ferris read the survey report slowly. He read the arithmetic. He asked 3 questions, each of which Colter answered directly, without dressing up the parts that were uncertain. "You're thin," Ferris said. "I know. The Garfield payment is not in hand." "It's a handshake from a man Decker Pell vouches for," Colter said. "I can provide Pell's written statement if that helps." Ferris considered. "It helps." He looked at the survey report again. "The spring is the key asset here. If someone held that survey and used it to constrain your water access, this whole arrangement would be at risk. Which is why the teller parcel matters." "Yes." Ferris set the papers down. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of men making a decision they've already mostly made, but want to be seen making carefully. 80 days on first payment. Rate is posted on that board behind you. Colter looked at the board. The rate was higher than he wanted and lower than Silas had offered. It was legitimate. "Done," he said. He left the county seat with a signed bank draft and the particular cold clarity of a man who has just committed himself to a thing he cannot undo. He was not afraid of it. He was aware of it the way you're aware of a fence you've just climbed over. There's no going back the same way, and that's the point. He arrived back at Ashwood as the sun was going down and sat at the table under the east window and wrote out the full situation in the margin of his lumber inventory, which was what he used when he needed to see something laid flat. Then he folded the paper and put it on top of the ledger. Elowen came Friday morning. She read everything he'd laid out without speaking. She checked the bank rate against the figures. She sat for a moment with her pen not moving. "The timing is right," she said. "If Garfield's second payment comes through within 6 weeks, you'll make the first bank payment without going below your operating margin. And if it doesn't come in 6 weeks," she paused. It was a short pause, but he noticed it. "Then we look at the Garfield contract and see if there are grounds to accelerate. Or we talk to Ferris about a 30-day extension, which on this kind of arrangement is usually available once if your first payment history is clean." "We," he said. She looked up. "You said we," he said. He said it quietly, not making anything of it, just noting it. She looked at the page. "I said we," she confirmed in the same matter-of-fact tone she used for everything. He didn't say anything more about it. "I'll go see Teller today," she said, "with the bank draft." "You don't have to. 2 people showing up is more certain than 1, she said. "And I want to look at that north parcel before we own it." He noticed she'd said we again. He thought she noticed it too this time. She didn't correct it. They rode to Teller's together, and Teller accepted the bank draft and signed the transfer paper with the county seal, and the Teller parcel, 40 acres, north fenced down in 2 places. A small creek that ran dry in August but reliable, otherwise became part of the Ashwood holding before sundown. On the way home, Elowen pulled her horse to a stop at the north fence and looked at the parcel. "Creek," she said, "runs dry in August. Not if you improve the draw." She was looking at the topography the way the land ran, where the moisture would collect. A small earthwork improvement at the upper end, maybe 40 feet of channel work. "You'd hold more water into September." She looked at him. "That's a summer project." It was December. She was planning summer. He looked at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She gave him a look that said she knew it wasn't nothing, and turned her horse south toward Ashwood. Silas Crowder found out about the Teller sale on a Saturday. Colter knew this because Silas appeared at Ashwood on Saturday afternoon, with a quality of controlled anger that was different from his previous visits. The pleasant neighbor manner was gone, replaced by something more direct and less careful. Pulled up in the yard and didn't dismount, which was its own kind of message. "You bought Teller," he said. "I did. County Land Bank." "That's right." Silas looked at the farmhouse, at the barn, at the stacked wood. The evaluating look of a man reassessing a situation. "You've been busy." "Work to do, I'm doing it," Colter said. Same words he'd used in September, from up on the roof. He said them with the same flatness. The survey, Silas said. Pine's report is filed with the Territorial Land Office, Colter said. If you'd like a copy, you'd apply there. Something moved in Silas's face. Not the between anger and amusement look he'd had before. This was cleaner than that. Just anger, with the social coating worn off. You've been preparing for this since September. I've been repairing a farmhouse since September, Colter said. The rest of it came as it came. The Hawthorne girl's been helping you. Miss Hawthorne has been conducting her own business arrangements. Some of them have been useful to both of us. Both of you. Silas looked at him with an expression that had a speculative quality in it, working something out. Bram's letting her run around this valley, making arrangements and calling them her own business. You'd have to ask Bram what he thinks, Colter said. What I know is that she's been paid for her work, by Pell and by Garfield, and she's negotiated her own terms. And nobody has run her anywhere she didn't choose to go. She broke that horse. She did. Impressive for a woman who... I'm going to stop you there, Colter said. His voice was still level. I've heard you finish that kind of sentence before, and I don't find it interesting. She broke the horse because she understood him, and she knew what she was doing. That's the whole of it. Silas looked at him for a long moment. The controlled anger had shifted into something colder and more calculating, and Colter recognized that this was the more dangerous version, the man who had stopped being impatient and gone back to being patient. The bank rate you're carrying, Silas said, is between me and the bank. Ferris talks. Ferris is a professional, Colter said. He doesn't talk. 80 days on first payment, Silas said. He said the number casually, like he'd found it in the air. Colter kept his face where it was. If the Garfield arrangement doesn't pay in time, Silas said, you'll miss the first payment. And a missed payment on a land bank note puts the teller parcel back into question. That's how finance works, Colter said. It's also not your business. I'm making it my business, Silas said, and now the pleasant surface was entirely gone, and what was underneath was the man who had walked into Bram Hawthorne's kitchen and put a number on a woman like she was furniture. You've been clever. The survey, the parcel, the documents. But you're one bad payment away from a problem you can't ledger book your way out of. Maybe, Colter said. Not maybe. Maybe, Colter said again with the same tone. Should go, Crowder. Silas sat on his horse for another 5 seconds, which was a long time when someone was telling you to leave. Then he turned and rode out of the yard. Colter went inside. He sat at the table and looked at the east window and the cold December light coming through it. And he thought about what Silas had said about the first payment, and he thought about Ferris talking. And he thought about who in the county seat moved in circles that included Silas Crowder. Then he took out his piece of paper and added the visit to the record, including the specific phrase about 80 days on first payment, because that was information Silas shouldn't have had, and noting where you have a gap is how you find it. He put the paper in the ledger. When Elowen came Tuesday, he showed her the record. She read it. She was quiet for a moment. He knows the terms. Yes. Ferris wouldn't have said it. No, he paused. Who else knew? She thought about it. Tell her. She set the ledger down. He knew you were going to the bank. He knew you were doing it within 10 days, which implies the terms. Teller and Crowder. Crowder held Teller's mortgage, she said. Even after the sale, that's a relationship. She looked out the window. Teller probably told him what you said on the porch. That's not malicious. Just talk. It doesn't need to be malicious to be a problem, she said. She turned back to the table. We need the Garfield payment before the 80 days. I know. I'll go see Garfield this week. His second horse is ready, she said. I've been working with the Arab Cross for 3 weeks. He's rideable. I was going to ask for another week, but I don't need another week. I need the payment. She said it plainly, without apology, the way she said everything that was a practical truth rather than a comfortable one. Sometimes you finish early because you can. Sometimes you finish early because you have to. The horse doesn't know the difference. Is the horse actually ready? She looked at him with the hazel eyes that were darker in winter light, more brown than green. If I said he was ready, would you take that at face value? Yes, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. He's ready, she said. She went to Garfield's spread on Wednesday, taking the Arab Cross through his final assessment, and Garfield watched and asked 2 questions and paid her in the yard. She came back to Ashwood that afternoon with the cash in her saddlebag, and her coat smelling of horse and her boots muddy from a fence she'd had to dismount and walk around. She put the money on the table. He looked at it. That covers the first bank payment and leaves margin, she said, already doing the calculation. If your winter operating costs come in where you estimated, you'll make the second payment from the cattle income. He looked at the money. He looked at her. She had just accelerated 3 weeks of work to solve a problem he hadn't solved. She had done it because it needed doing, and she had done it without making anything of it. Elowen, he said. Don't, she said. I wasn't going to say. You were going to say thank you in a way that sounds like an apology, she said. Don't. I'm not doing you a favor. I'm solving a problem that affects both of us. She pulled her coat off and laid it over the back of her chair. There's a difference. He sat with that for a moment. Both of us, he said. She looked at him. There was a quality in the room right now, the afternoon light through the east window, the stove working, the ledger open between them and the money on the table that was different from other afternoons. Not dramatically different, just weighted. Yes, she said. Deliberate, both of us. He had been careful. Since September, about not moving faster than she was comfortable with, about not letting what he felt push the shape of things before she'd decided what shape she wanted. He had been careful in the way of a man who understands that the worst thing you can do with something you want is to grab at it. But they were sitting at a table they had argued about and built together, in a house she had helped him close against the winter, looking at money she had earned and brought here, and she had said both of us twice in one conversation. I want to ask you something, he said. She looked at him. Not about the money, he said. Not about the bank or the parcel or Crowder. She was very still. I want to know, he said, what you want. Not what you're willing to consider. Not what makes practical sense. What you want. The room was quiet. She looked at the table. At her hands, which were flat on the ledger cover. She was a woman who answered questions carefully, and he waited while she answered this one carefully. I want work that is mine, she said. That has my name on it. Not because someone allowed it, but because I built it. She paused. I want a table under a window where I can do that work without explaining why I'm doing it. You have that, I know. She looked up. I also want someone who knows I have it. Who doesn't need me to be less than I am so they can feel like more. She held his gaze. I've had men want my face. I've had men want my father's ranch. I've had Silas Crowder put a number on me in my own kitchen. She paused. I have not had someone sit in a second chair and ask me to show them the numbers. He was very quiet. The second chair, he said. The second chair, she said. I brought a measurement for it the same day I brought the window measurements. You didn't notice. He thought back. She was right, he hadn't noticed. He'd built one chair, and she'd given him the second set of dimensions along with the window specifications, and he'd built it without thinking about what it meant that she'd ask for two. I should have noticed, he said. You did notice. Just later. She looked at the window. Sometimes later is all right. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. That, his rough, oversized, still calloused hand covering her hands where they lay on the ledger. She looked at their hands. She turned hers over slowly and held his. I'm not going to be easy to be married to, she said. He almost smiled. I'm not asking you to be easy. I'll have opinions about the breeding records, and the accounting, and the way the South Fence should run. I'd expect that, and I'll be right more often than is comfortable. Probably, he said. She looked at him then, fully, with the clear hazel eyes that he had been looking at since September, and still did not have a complete accounting of. Ask me properly, Colter. He had not planned this. He had $11 in September, and he had a land bank note and a farmhouse with an east window and a woman who had just told him what she wanted with the same directness she brought to everything else. He did not have a ring. He did not have a speech. He said, "Will you build a life here with me? Not because I've earned it, because you want to." The stove settled. Cottonwoods moved outside. She looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment he understood all the ways this could have gone differently, all the months when she was watching and deciding, all the times she could have concluded that he was like the rest and turned away. Yes, she said. It came out quiet and certain, the way her answers always did when she had thought something through. He held her hand. She didn't pull it back. They told Bram that evening. He was at his kitchen table when they came in together, and he looked at them both, at their faces, at the fact that they had arrived together, at the quality of something settled between them, and before either of them said anything, he nodded once, a brief, precise nod, and looked back at the table. "Well," he said. "Papa," Elowen said. "I heard you." He looked up. His face did the complicated thing it did when he had feelings he didn't have vocabulary for. "Sit down." They sat. He poured coffee, 3 cups. He set the cups on the table and sat back down, and he looked at Colter with the specific evaluating silence he'd used in September on the porch, and Colter met it the same way he had then directly, without trying to fill it. "You've done what I asked," Bram said. "The house is livable," Colter said. "Past livable. I know." He looked at Elowen. Something moved across his face. "I want to say something." They waited. "I set conditions," he said. "Timber. Because I thought—" He stopped. He looked at his coffee. "I told myself it was about whether the man could provide. Whether he had what it took." He paused. "I've been thinking about that." "Papa, you don't—" "Let me say it," he said. She stopped. "I've known what you can do since you were 17, he said. "I taught you most of it. I knew you could manage the books before you were 20. I knew you could read a horse the way most men never learn to." He looked at the table. "I kept that inside the ranch because I thought I was protecting you, keeping the hard world from seeing you and wanting pieces of you." He was quiet. "I think I was also keeping the world from seeing you, period. And that's different, and it was wrong." The kitchen was very still. Elowen's hand moved on the table. She didn't say anything. "What she did at Silver Crown," Bram said, addressing Colter now. "You saw it." "I was there," Colter said. "Half the valley was there." Bram looked at his coffee. 3 men failed that horse. She understood it in 2 weeks. He paused. "Nobody talks about her face anymore when they mention Silver Crown. Did you notice that?" "I noticed. Garfield came to my fence last week," Bram said. "He wanted to know if she'd take on 2 more horses in spring." From a neighbor of his. He looked up. He didn't say anything about how she looked. He talked about what she did. He was quiet for a moment. "That's new." Elowen's eyes had gone bright. She was looking at the table. "I'm not going to give conditions this time," Bram says to Colter. "Her answer is her own to give." "She gave it," Colter said. "This afternoon." Bram nodded. He picked up his coffee. He looked at Elowen for a moment, the long look of a father who has known a person their whole life and is seeing something shift in the shape of what comes next. "The east window," he said. "It gets morning light." "Most of the morning," she said. "Good." He set down his cup. "The Halbert boy makes furniture. He does good work. If you need another piece for that room—" "The table is fine," Elowen said. Bram looked at Colter. "I built it," Colter said. Bram's mouth moved. It was, for Bram, the equivalent of a full smile. "I know you did," he said. "I went and looked at it when I came to the property." He paused. "The joint in the top. I didn't have wide enough boards." "It doesn't matter in use," Bram said, which was the same thing Elowen had said in October, word for word. And Colter understood that she had learned precision and practicality from this man, and that the man had no idea how much of himself he'd put into her. They stayed for supper. It was a quiet meal, the 3 of them, with the particular companionable quiet of people who have just moved through something difficult and have arrived somewhere they can rest. After supper, when Colter had gone to bring the horses around, Bram sat at the table with his daughter for a moment. "He's a straight man," Bram said. "I know," Elowen said. "Stubborn. Very," she agreed. "He'll drive you crazy." "Probably." She stood and took the cups to the basin. "I'll drive him crazy, too." "That seems fair." Bram said nothing for a moment. "The second chair," he said. She stopped. "He built it from your measurement," Bram said. "When I came to look at the property, I measured it. The height is cut to your specifications." He paused. He did that before he knew what it meant. She stood at the basin with her back to him. "Yes," she said. "That's a man who listens first and then acts," Bram said. "Those are hard to find." "I know they are." She heard him stand from the table, the particular sound of Bram Hawthorne pushing his chair back, the slight effort of a man in his mid-50s after a long day. Came and stood beside her at the basin. He was not a man who touched easily. He put his hand on her shoulder for a moment, briefly, The way you'd touch something you didn't want to break. I'm sorry I kept you small, he said. She turned her head. I didn't know I was doing it, he said. That's not an excuse. It's just what's true. She turned and put her arms around him, which was not something she did often either, and he stood there and let her, one hand on her back, the other at his side. You taught me everything I know, she said. Not everything, he said. You figured plenty out yourself. She stepped back. Outside, she could hear Colter with the horses. He doesn't need you to be less, Bram said. That's the thing. He never did. She looked at her father. No, she said, he didn't. She went out. December moved through the valley the way December does in that country, hard and deliberate, wind off the ridge, ground frozen solid before the 15th, the kind of cold that tests every seal and joint and stacked cord. Ashwood held. The roof kept the heat, the stove drew well. The east window didn't frost on the inside, which was the test of a well-fitted frame in serious cold. Colter made the first bank payment on day 73, 7 days early, and Ferris received it without comment, which was the best kind of comment. Elowen came Tuesdays and Fridays, and then some Thursdays, and once on a Sunday, when she had been working through a problem in the breeding records and wanted to check it against his cattle documentation. She also, on a Thursday in mid-December, brought the second horse she'd taken from Garfield, the Arab Cross, through a final session at Ashwood rather than at Garfield's place, because Ashwood was closer and because she had quietly begun to treat it as a place that was partly hers. Colter watched her work the horse in the yard and did not say anything about the fact that she had brought her work to his place, because the right response to that was not words. The horse was, as she had said, completely ready. He moved well and was quiet, and showed no sign of the spook issues that had been his presenting problem. When she was done, she put him in the barn beside Patience and came in for coffee, and it was such a natural sequence, the horse in the barn, the coffee, the ledger on the table, that he wasn't sure either of them noticed it until after. Garfield wants 3 more horses in spring, she said. You told me. I'm thinking about building a small working pen, she said, on the east side of the barn, separate from the main yard so the horses being trained aren't in the same space as the working cattle. She opened the ledger. The materials cost isn't large. The labor is mostly post-setting, which I can do post-setting, he said. I know you can. She made a note. I want to pay for the materials from the training income, not from the ranch operating account. I want it to be mine. It'll be on Ashwood land. I know where it'll be, she said. And she said it with the edge that came when something mattered, and she was making sure it was heard. The pen is mine. The land is yours. Those are 2 different things, and I want the distinction to be clear from the beginning. He looked at her. The table was clear from the beginning, she said. That was your idea, or you following mine, which amounted to the same thing. I want this to be the same. He understood what she was doing. She was establishing in practical terms that her work was her own, inside the shared life they were building, that she wasn't going to be subsumed into the ranch's accounting. The way women's work so often was, invisible labor wrapped inside a man's ledger. The pen she built would be on the deed, but in the accounts it would be hers, income and expense and return, and anyone who looked at the books would see it. The pen is yours, he said. We'll need it in the deed notes, she said. When the time comes. When the time comes, he agreed. She wrote something in the ledger. He sat across the table and looked at the east window, at the December gray coming through it, at the light falling on the table and on her hands, and on the open pages of the ledger with its neat columns and careful figures. He was building something. He had been building something since September, 1 board and 1 day at a time, from salvaged material and borrowed tools and $11 and a credit arrangement with a tired lumberyard owner and a woman who showed up with a leather book and told him about a window wall. He had thought in September that he was building a house. He understood now that the house was the least of it. What he was building was harder to name and harder to finish and had no point at which you could stand back and say done. It required 2 chairs and 2 ledgers, and someone at the table who would tell you when your arithmetic was wrong, and when you'd said all right with your mouth, but not with your face, and someone who would stay in the saddle when the gate went and tell you afterward that she hadn't been calm because she trusted you with the inside of it. He was 35 years old. He had been a long time finding the thing worth building. He wasn't going to waste it by grabbing at it, or by standing above it, or by thinking that the point of it was something he'd earned. Point of it was that it was real. Elowen finished her calculation and looked up and found him looking at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She looked at him the way she looked at the columns in her ledger when a figure didn't add up. Then she went back to her work. Outside, the December wind moved through the bare cottonwoods, and inside the east window the light held for another hour, falling across the table that was solid and imperfect and completely real. And neither of them said anything more for a while, because sometimes the right thing is to sit in the thing you've built and simply let it be what it is. They married in the first week of April, when the cottonwoods at Ashwood had just begun to show green. It was not a large wedding. Elowen had not wanted large, and Colter had not wanted large. And when they had discussed it in February, sitting at the table under the east window, the conversation had lasted about 4 minutes before they agreed, the Ashwood yard. The people they actually knew, the kind of afternoon that ended with supper and didn't require anyone to perform anything. Bram stood on one side. Clara Pell came with her husband. Garfield rode over with his wife, a tall, quiet woman named Ruth, who shook Elowen's hand at the start and said, "Decker Pell says you're the best person with a horse he's ever seen." Elowen had said thank you in the flat way she said thank you when something landed correctly, which Ruth apparently recognized because she smiled and let it rest there. Aldrich Pine came, because Colter had asked him, and because Pine was the kind of man who showed up when asked. The Halbert boys came, who had helped with the barn bents, and 2 of Bram's hands who had known Elowen most of her life, and sat on the fence for the ceremony with their hats in their hands. Silas Crowder was not invited. The ceremony was short. County official named Marsh performed it, a broad, friendly man who had married enough couples to know that what people needed from him was brevity and a voice loud enough to carry across a yard. He gave them both. When Marsh got to the part about the threshold and tradition, Colter stepped toward the farmhouse door, with the instinct of a man who had absorbed 1,000 small pieces of what was expected, and then he stopped himself. He stopped and turned and looked at Elowen. She was watching him. "May I?" he said. He meant the carrying, the threshold, the old gesture. She looked at him standing there, in his good shirt, the same blue cotton shirt from September, washed again until it had gone another degree softer, and she felt something she didn't entirely have words for. Not sentiment exactly. More like recognition. The particular recognition of someone who has been watching a person carefully for a long time and has finally seen the thing they were watching for. "No," she said. He went still. Then she reached out and took his hand. "I want us to walk in together," she said. So they did. Crowd was quiet for a moment, and then Clara Pell made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one, and Garfield clapped once. And Bram stood at the edge of the yard, with his hands clasped in front of him, and looked at the closed farmhouse door with the expression of a man who has just understood sooner, and is grateful he got there at all. Spring that followed was the kind of spring the valley produced, when it was trying to make up for the winter it had just delivered, green and sudden, the grass coming in fast. The creek on the North Teller parcel running clear and cold all the way through May. Colter started the cattle work in earnest, expanding the operation with 2 additional purchases from a rancher retiring south of the county seat. The Teller pasture, once the fencing was repaired, gave him grazing room he hadn't had at the original Ashwood boundary. Elowen built the training pen. It went up on the east side of the barn in the 3rd week of April, posts set by Colter while she directed the layout, panels hung by both of them over 2 weekends. It was not elaborate. It was exactly what it needed to be: the right diameter, proper footing, a gate that opened smoothly and latched without fighting. When it was done, she walked around it once, testing the panels, checking the gate twice. "Good," she said. Colter leaned on the fence. "That's all?" "That's all." She tested the latch one more time. "Good is enough." She had 4 horses scheduled through April and May 3 from Garfield's network, and one from a rancher named Booth, who had heard about Silver Crown from Pell and written a letter in January asking if she took on contracted work. She wrote back yes with her terms, and Booth had agreed by return mail. Terms were hers. The pen was hers. The income went into her account at the county land bank, separate from the ranch operating account, which she had made clear before the wedding, and which Colter had agreed to without argument, which was She had decided. One of the most significant things he had ever done. Silas Crowder made one more attempt in March. It came not directly. He had apparently learned that direct attempts produced recorded visits and documented exchanges, and a woman who kept precise notes, but through the county property board, where he filed a challenge to Pine's survey based on an alternative reading of the Ashwood deed. The challenge named a different boundary marker, a rock formation instead of the double-trunk cottonwood, and argued that from this marker the survey line ran differently, and the spring came off Ashwood and onto what had been the Teller parcel. The challenge was filed competently. Silas had hired someone who knew what they were doing. It was not frivolous. Elowen found out about it on a Thursday when she went to the county seat for feed supplies and stopped at the property board office because she checked the property board whenever she was in town, which was something Colter had not known she did until she told him about the challenge on Thursday evening. Came home with the filing in her hand and laid it on the table. He read it. The rock formation, he said. It exists, she said. It's on the plat. It's a legitimate marker. She sat down. The argument is that the cottonwood is a living thing and could have moved, grown, or been replaced while the rock is fixed. Therefore, the rock is the more reliable marker. Is that a valid argument? It's a legal argument, she said. Whether it's valid depends on the territorial land court. She opened the ledger to a page near the back where she had already begun writing. But Pine's report addresses this. He documented both markers. The cottonwood is identified in the 1,871 territorial record as an existing mature tree, which means in 1,871 it was already old. The original survey plat specifically notes the double trunk as a distinctive identifying feature. She pointed to the page. A tree that was mature in 1,871 and is described with a specific, unusual feature doesn't move. Fixed as the rock. Pine can argue this. We need Pine. I wrote to him this afternoon from the post office in town. She paused. I also wrote to the Territorial Land Office directly, requesting the original 1,871 field notes, not just the plat. The field notes will have the surveyor's handwritten descriptions of the markers. The cottonwood is described in detail in the 1,871 field notes. It closes the argument. He looked at her. You did all of this today. I found out today, she said, as if this were obvious. You solve problems when they arrive, not when you've had time to be upset about them. She looked at the page. The hearing will be in May, probably. We'll need Pine present and the field notes in hand. And if the field notes don't have enough detail, then we have Pine's transit readings, which show that the rock formation and the cottonwood, used as markers, produce survey lines that diverge by 11 degrees over the relevant distance, she said. At that divergence, the spring either falls clearly on Ashwood or clearly off it, depending on which marker you choose. The court will have to decide which marker the original survey intended. She paused. Which is why the 1,871 field notes matter. If the original surveyor wrote down the cottonwood in detail and didn't mention the rock, that's the answer. He sat back. She looked at him across the table. I'm not scared of this, she said. Came out quiet and factual. I want to be clear about that. He's going to keep trying to find an angle, and I'm not going to spend the rest of my life being scared of the next angle. We document, respond. We go to the hearing, and we win or we don't, and then we figure out the next step. She closed the ledger. That's all it is. He thought about September, when he'd sat on the farmhouse steps with $11 and looked at a collapsed barn and thought the math didn't work. He thought about the first time she'd come with the ledger and started running columns before he'd asked her to. He thought about Rook and the gate going and her voice saying easy in a yard full of people who had come expecting to see her fail. I know you're not scared, he said. Good. She stood up. Supper. She made supper. He set the table. They ate and talked about the horses coming in April and the north fence on the Teller parcel that needed 3 new posts before the wet season finished, and the specific problem of a calf that had been born 2 days ago and wasn't gaining weight the way it should, which was worrying in the way early signs of a small problem are worrying, because you can't tell yet if it's a small problem or a larger one in its early stages. The Silas Crowder challenge sat in the ledger and they let it sit there, because it was accounted for and documented and responded to, And a problem you have accounted for and documented and responded to is a different kind of problem than the kind that catches you in the yard without your paperwork. The 1,871 field notes arrived from the Territorial Land Office in the second week of April. Elowen opened the envelope at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, and Colter watched her read, and he knew from the quality of her stillness as she read that it was what they needed before she said a word. She set the page down. The original surveyor's name was Clement Rath, she said. He wrote everything down. Everything. She touched the page. Cottonwood entry reads, double trunk cottonwood, net corner marker, trunks diverging at approximately 2 feet height, each trunk diameter 16 inches, tree of substantial age and unusual form, not likely to be confused with any other tree in this section. She looked up. Not likely to be confused with any other tree in this section. Colter was quiet. He even wrote that, she said. It was not triumphant. It was the tone of someone who has found the right tool for the job they've been trying to do. The original surveyor used that tree specifically because it was unmistakable. It's in the record. She paused. And the rock formation? Not mentioned? One line, she said. Limestone outcropping. South section. Noted but not used as survey reference. Formation not distinctive enough for reliable future identification. Kitchen was completely still. Then Colter said he discarded the rock. In 1,871, Elowen said. He looked at both and chose the cottonwood because the rock wasn't distinctive enough. She laid the page flat. Silas's entire challenge is built on a marker the original surveyor explicitly set aside. He looked at the page. Write to Pine today, he said. I already wrote to him yesterday telling him the notes were arriving, she said. I'll send the relevant passage today. She was already copying it into the ledger in her neat, precise hand. The hearing is May 14th. May 14th was a clear, cold morning that warmed into a decent afternoon by the time the Territorial Land Court convened in the county seat. The hearing room was a plain space above the assay office, with wooden chairs and a long table for the examiner, and a smell of old paper that said this room had been making decisions for a long time. Silas came with a lawyer from the Capitol, an angular man named Price, who had the manner of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in a room. Colter came with Pine and a folder that contained the field notes, the survey report, the transit readings, and Elowen's precise written summary of the documentary chain, organized, dated, cross-referenced. Clear enough that a person who knew nothing about the history of the Ashwood boundary could read through it in 20 minutes and understand exactly what the evidence showed. Elowen sat beside Colter at the respondents' table. Price looked at her when they came in with the evaluating look of a man cataloging who he was dealing with. His gaze moved from her face to the folder she was carrying to Pine beside her, and Colter watched the man recalibrate, slightly, and file her in a different category than the one he'd started with. Good, Colter thought. Let him recalibrate. The examiner was a territorial appointee named Holloway, 60s, dry and deliberate, with the manner of a man who had sat at long tables and heard long arguments and had developed a deep professional skepticism about anything that wasn't written down. Price presented Silas's challenge first. He was thorough and well-prepared, as expected. He argued the reliability of fixed geological features against biological ones, cited 2 precedents from other territorial cases, and presented a carefully drawn alternative survey map that showed, from the rock formation marker, the line running as Silas claimed. It was a solid argument. Colter had expected a solid argument. The challenge was solid, or it wouldn't have been filed. Then Pine presented. Pine was not a dramatic man. He did not argue. He laid documents on the table in sequence and described what each one showed in the same careful, specific language he used when he was talking to the land itself. He walked Holloway through the transit readings. He explained the 11-degree divergence between the 2 possible survey lines. He placed the 1,871 field notes in front of Holloway and read the relevant passages aloud. When he read the passage about the cottonwood, the double trunk, the 16-inch diameter trunks, not likely to be confused with any other tree. In this section, the room was quiet, in the way rooms get quiet when something has just been said that doesn't need elaboration. Then he read the passage about the rock formation. Noted but not used as survey reference. Formation not distinctive enough for reliable future identification. Price objected that the field notes were interpretive rather than determinative. Holloway looked at him with the expression of a man who has heard an argument that technically has a point and practically has no merit, and said, "Counselor, the original surveyor explicitly considered and rejected this marker in 1871. You're asking me to use the rejected marker. That's a high bar." "The tree may not be the same tree," Price said. "May I?" Elowen said. Holloway looked at her. The 1871 field notes describe a cottonwood with trunks diverging at 2 feet height, each 16 inches in diameter, she said. Spoke evenly, without performance. "I measured the cottonwood at the northeast corner of the Ashwood boundary in March of this year. The trunks diverge at 22 inches height. Each trunk is 29 inches in diameter." She laid a page on the table. "That is consistent with approximately 55 to 60 years of growth from the measurements recorded in 1871. The divergence point has risen as the tree has grown, which is the natural behavior of a double-trunk tree. The diameter increase is consistent with standard cottonwood growth rates in this soil type and elevation." She paused. "The tree described in the 1871 field notes is the tree at the northeast corner of the Ashwood boundary. The measurements confirm it." The room was quiet again. Price said, "That's not—" "Do you have a rebuttal measurement?" Holloway asked. Price did not have a rebuttal measurement. Holloway looked at the field notes for a long moment. He looked at Pine's survey report. He looked at Elowen's measurement page. "I'll have a decision in 3 days," he said. The decision came in 2. Holloway found for Ashwood on all points. The spring was on Ashwood land. Pine's survey stood. Challenge was dismissed. The written decision cited the 1871 field notes in its second paragraph, specifically the passage about the cottonwood being not likely to be confused with any other tree in this section, and noted that the challenger had failed to rebut the documentary evidence linking the tree in the current survey to the tree described in the original plat. Elowen read the decision at the kitchen table on a Friday morning, and when she was done, she folded it carefully and put it in the ledger at the back, behind the records of Silas's visits and the copy of the teller transfer and Pine's certified report. "That's done," she said. Colter was sitting across from her. "That's done," he agreed. She looked at the ledger for a moment. Then she closed it. "He won't try again," she said. It wasn't a question exactly. It was an assessment. The field notes close it. Any further challenge would be working against documented primary evidence, and the cost of mounting it would exceed what he could gain. She paused. "He's a calculating man. He'll calculate this and move on." "To someone else's spring," Colter said. "Maybe." She looked out the window. Or maybe not. Men like Silas don't always get worse. Sometimes they just run out of easy targets and find something else to do with their ambition. She paused. "I don't know which he'll be. I know it won't be us." She said us the way she said we now without noticing it, because it had become the natural word. He noticed it every time. Summer came in earnest, and with it the second round of training horses, and the calf that had been worrying them in April turned out to be a small problem after all, slow to gain but gaining, and by June was indistinguishable from the others in the field. Colter repaired the north fence on the Teller parcel and improved the draw at the upper end of the creek with a modest earthwork channel that held water into the 3rd week of August, which was 2 weeks further than the creek had ever run in anyone's memory. It was not a triumph. It was a properly fixed fence and a creek that ran longer than it had. Those were the kinds of things that didn't look like much from the outside and made a ranch work. Garfield sent 3 more horses in July, which was 1 more than Elowen had agreed to in spring, and she told him directly that she had agreed to 3, and the 3rd one was going to wait until she'd finished the current 2. Garfield said he understood and sent a written apology. She wrote back, accepting it, and noting that she'd take the 3rd horse in September. He sent a note thanking her. Colter read both notes without comment. Then he said, "He's afraid of you." "He's not afraid of me," she said. "He respects me." "There's a difference." "There's a difference," he agreed. "He's still afraid of you." She looked at him. "Both things," he said. She went back to her work, and he thought he saw the corner of her mouth move. In August, Bram came to Ashwood for supper and stayed the evening. He came once a month now, not announced, not invited formally, just appearing on his horse on a Sunday evening, the way a man comes to a place he has decided to treat his family. He was easier at Ashwood than Colter had expected him to be. He came in and sat at the kitchen table and ate what was put in front of him, and talked about cattle and pasture and the weather on the ridge, and occasionally said something about the horsework that was precise and knowledgeable, and showed that he had been paying close attention to what his daughter was doing. One August evening, after supper, Bram walked the property. Not in the evaluating way he had walked it in October, taking the measure of progress. He walked it the way a person walks a place they've decided to think of as good. He went to the barn and looked at the horses, 3 training horses in the pen, and Patience in her stall, and the new cattle horses in the back, and then he came out and stood by the training pen and looked at the east side of the farmhouse. The window was bright in the late evening sun. Through it, visible from the yard, the lamp on the table was already lit, because Elowen had gone inside to finish a calculation. Bram stood there and looked at that window for a long moment. Colter was by the barn and didn't say anything, because this was not a moment that wanted words. Then Bram turned and said, "The stacking on your woodshed is wrong." "I know," Colter said, the back rows leaning. "Fix it before the snow." "I will." Bram nodded. He looked at the window once more briefly. "She's good," he said. He meant the horsework. He also meant everything else. They both knew that. "She is," Colter said. Bram went inside. There is a thing that people who have not lived close to the land sometimes misunderstand about it, which is that the hardest part is not the labor. The labor is just labor hard, physical, exhausting, and also clarifying in the way that work with your hands is always clarifying, because it gives you something real to push against and real to see when it's done. The hard part is the patience. The willingness to build something that won't be finished this season or next. That requires you to make a decision in November whose consequence won't arrive until May. That demands you trust your own judgment when you can't see the outcome yet. Elowen had always known this. She had known it the way she knew the breeding records and the survey boundaries and the growth rate of a double-trunk cottonwood through attention, through the habit of watching carefully and writing things down and not looking away from the difficult parts. What she had not entirely expected was to find someone who understood it the same way. Not because she had thought herself unusual. She had known she was capable. She had known since she was 17 and found the lineage error in her father's records that she saw things other people missed, and she had spent 10 years watching people notice her face and miss the rest of her, and had come to a quiet, private conclusion that the rest of her was hers to keep. And then a man had come to her father's porch in September with $11 and the specific, unusual quality of saying exactly what he meant without dressing it up, and she had thought, "I'm going to watch this carefully." She had watched carefully. She had watched him climb onto a rotting roof and not complain about it. She had watched him take the framing solution she showed him and use it without making anything of where it came from. She had watched him sit in the second chair, the chair she had specified in measurements she'd given him, without explaining why, and hold her numbers up to the light honestly, including the error she caught. She had watched him say all right when she told him not to come to Silver Crown, and mean it with his face and not just his mouth. She had watched him look at Silas Crowder and say, "I don't find it interesting," in a voice, with nothing hot in it, just the flatness of a man who had genuinely stopped finding it interesting. She had been watching for the things people give away when they don't know they're being watched. What Colter gave away, consistently, without apparent effort, was that he was not performing. He was not working to appear a certain way. He was too busy solving real problems in real conditions with whatever he actually had. That was rarer than people knew. The first fall of their married life, a rancher came to Ashwood from 2 valleys over. His name was Sutter, and he had a horse he described as unmanageable, and a manner that suggested he had been told about Elowen Wynn by at least 3 people, and was still, on arrival, faintly surprised to be consulting a woman. He stood in the yard and looked at the training pen, and looked at Elowen, and said, "I was told you're the one to talk to." "I am," she said. "They said you fixed the Silver Crown horse." "The black." "Rook," she said. "Yes. 3 men failed that horse." "I know," she said. "I was the 4th. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, the same recalibration she had seen before, in Pell, in Garfield. The moment when the category a person has been placed in turns out to be the wrong category and the filing needs to be redone. "Tell me about your horse," she said. He told her. She listened and asked 4 questions, and by the 3rd question he was answering her with the same seriousness he would have brought to talking with any professional, which was all she had ever asked for. They agreed on terms. She wrote them down. He signed. When he rode out of the yard, Colter came out of the barn where he had been working on a hinge and stood beside her. He almost argued about the price, he said. He thought about it, she agreed. He decided not to. What did he decide? That I knew what I was worth, she said. She watched Sutter's horse disappear down the lane. And that arguing with someone who knows what they're worth is a losing position. She said it simply as a practical observation, but it was not a simple thing. She had spent 27 years in a valley where people noticed her face first. She had spent those years doing work that mattered and watching it be invisible, watching men praise her looks in the same breath they dismissed her judgment, watching her father protect her in ways that taught the world she needed protection. She had done the work anyway, in her father's ledger, and in his barn, and in the precise rows of the breeding records, and in the quiet of her own knowledge, waiting. She had not waited to be given permission. She had waited for the right conditions, and when the conditions came an east window, a second chair, a man who asked her to show him the numbers she had walked in, and sat down and started working. This was what she understood that nobody had taught her. Worth is not conferred. It is not something another person gives you when they finally see clearly. It exists before the seeing. It exists in the work, in the knowledge, in the habit of paying attention and writing things down and not looking away. The seeing matters. She had not pretended it didn't matter. Being seen clearly by Colter, by her father, by Pell and Garfield and Holloway and now Sutter, that mattered. It had given her room to operate, to put her name on her work, to have the pen she built recorded separately in her own account. The worth was always there. The seeing just proved it to everyone else. Autumn came again a year after September. Cottonwoods went gold and then bare, the way they did, and the east window filled the mornings with the particular clean light of October, falling across the table where 2 ledgers sat. Elowen's was neat and precise, the columns running true, the handwriting, the careful hand of a person who understood that a document is only as useful as its legibility. Colter's was improving. The columns were straighter than they'd been in winter. He still carried the arithmetic error tendency that she caught every 3 months or so, and she caught it the same way each time, not with correction in her voice, just with a pointed finger, and the words, "Try this column again." He tried the column again. He was getting better. One October morning, Elowen sat at the table early, before Colter was up, in the particular quiet of a house before it has decided to wake. The lamp was lit. The stove was going. Outside, the first light was coming through the cottonwoods. She opened the ledger to the back, where the documents were kept. The Pine report, the teller transfer, the field notes copy, the hearing decision, the records of Silas's visits, which had stopped in May and had not resumed. She looked at the record of the first visit, the Tuesday morning in September, before Colter had ever come to her father's porch. Silas walking into the kitchen without knocking, sitting at her father's table, saying $40 in the voice of a man who had never been told no and expected to stay told. She had been standing right there. He had looked at her like she was a painting he was thinking about buying. She remembered the feeling of that moment, the particular cold anger, different from fear, the feeling of someone looking directly at you and seeing something you were not. She had gotten the cloth and wiped the table after he left, which was not about the dirt on the table. It was about replacing the air in the room with something that didn't have his certainty in it. Closed the ledger. She heard Colter in the next room the particular sounds of him, which she had catalogued over a year without meaning to. The way he sat up before he stood up, the specific creak of the second board from the door. He came in and looked at her at the table in the lamplight and said, "Early." "I was thinking," she said. He went to the stove and added wood and put the coffee on. He did this without asking if she wanted coffee, because she always wanted coffee, and he had learned what always meant. "About what?" he said. "About the first time Silas came," she said. before you. He looked at her over the stove. I wiped the table after he left, she said, just to have something to do. I was angry and I didn't have anywhere to put it. I know, he said. Your father told me. She looked up. He told you that? In the barn. When I talked to him about the survey, he poured coffee. He said you wiped the table and he understood what it meant, and he didn't say anything at the time, and he wished he had. She was quiet. He said he wished he had told Crowder something other than, "She'll be here to speak for herself," Colter said. He set a cup in front of her. He thought he was respecting your capability. He understood later that he'd also left you alone with it. Couldn't have known Silas would. He knows that, Colter said. He still wishes he'd said something. He sat in the second chair. That's what fathers do. They find the things they could have done differently, and they stay with them. She looked at the cup. I'm not angry at him, she said. I know you're not. I was for a while. Not about Silas. About being kept small. She paused. I understood why he did it. Still angry about it. That's fair, Colter said. Both things, she said, echoing his phrase from the summer. Both things, he agreed. She picked up the cup. The coffee was too hot and she held it anyway, the warmth of it in her hands. I'm not angry anymore, she said, at either of them. It's hard to stay angry when you have the work and the pen and the ledger, and she stopped. She looked at the east window, where the October morning was coming through now, the light finding the table the way it did, reliable as the season. And the right chair to sit in, she said. He looked at her. She looked back. There was nothing to add to that. They both knew it. So they sat in the morning quiet of the kitchen they had kept through a winter and a spring and a summer, with the ledgers on the table and the coffee and the light, and they let it be what it was. Outside, the cottonwoods moved in the October wind, bare-branched and stubborn, rooted deep in the ground that had been here before any of them, and would be here after, indifferent to the particular human drama of being seen clearly and choosing to stay. Inside, the lamp burned down to morning. The first bent nail from the original ruined structure sat on the windowsill, where Colter had put it in October of the previous year, and neither of them had moved it since. It was a small, crooked, useless thing. It was also the first piece of ashwood either of them had touched. Kept it there. Some things you keep not because they are useful, but because they remind you what you started with, and what the distance is between that and where you are now, and how much of that distance was crossed not alone but together. One board and one argument and one honest ledger column at a time. That was ashwood. That was what they built. Not because he had earned her, or she had earned him, or either of them had proven something to the valley, or to Silas Crowder, or to the men who had come to Silver Crown expecting to watch her fail. But because two people had sat down at a table in the right light and decided to stop keeping their capable selves a secret from each other. The house was the proof of something, not his worth, not hers. Proof that two people, each fully themselves, can build something together that neither one could have built alone, and that this, more than any romantic notion or grand declaration, is what it actually means to choose someone. You choose them with the second chair. You choose them with the window measurements. You choose them every morning when you sit down and open the ledger and start the work. And if you're fortunate, genuinely fortunate, the kind of fortune that has more to do with seeing clearly than with luck, the person across the table is doing the same.